In the misty foothills of Oregon's Cascade Mountains, where ancient Douglas firs stand sentinel over rushing streams, nature's raw drama unfolds without witnesses. Except today. The morning fog clung to the mossy ground as the first golden rays of sunlight struggled to penetrate the forest canopy. The recent deluge had transformed gentle brooks into roaring torrents, reshaping the landscape with nature's careless power. Amid this primordial scene, an ominous gathering was taking place. 12 crows, their glossy black feathers reflecting iridescent blues and purples in the filtered light, had formed a tightening circle near the edge of Whitewater Creek. Their harsh calls echoed through the forest, a discordant symphony that overpowered even the thundering water. Something had caught their collective interest, something small, vulnerable, and trapped. Pressed against a fallen log partially submerged. In the swollen creek, a tiny bobcat cub struggled to maintain its footing on the slippery bark. Its distinctive spotted coat, designed by evolution to blend perfectly with dappled forest light, was now matted and sodden. One of its front paws was caught between branches, holding it prisoner as the water level continued to rise inexorably around its small body. The cub's golden eyes, wide with terror, darted between the approaching crows and the rushing water, two threats converging with deadly intent. The crows, opportunistic and intelligent, recognized vulnerability when they saw it. They had been tracking the cub's mother since dawn, watching as she frantically searched upstream for her missing offspring. Now, with the mother bobcat far enough away, they had converged on the defenseless cub. The boldest of the murder hopped closer, its obsidian beak aimed at the cub's exposed face. The little bobcat hissed weakly, a pitiful imitation of the fearsome sound its mother could produce. The first crow struck, a lightning-fast peck that caught the cub above its right eye. Blood welled immediately, bright crimson against tawny fur. The cub jerked back, losing its precarious balance and slipping further into the churning water. Another crow advanced, emboldened by the first attack. Then another. Soon they were taking turns, darting in to land vicious pecks while their companions maintained the circle, preventing any possibility of escape. This was nature's brutal efficiency at work. The weak would not survive, and the scavengers would hasten the inevitable. The crows' actions weren't cruel in any human sense. They were simply following the ancient programming of their species. The bobcat cub, separated from its mother during the flash flood, was now paying the price for that misfortune. Its tiny body trembled with exhaustion and pain, its struggles growing weaker with each passing minute. Away from this grim tableau, an old blue Ford pickup rattled along the narrow Forest Service road that paralleled Whitewater Creek. Behind the wheel, Dr. Meredith Tanner squinted through the windshield, navigating around potholes filled with rainwater from the previous night's storm. At 53, Meredith had spent the last 20 years as the head wildlife veterinarian at the Pacific Northwest Wildlife Recovery Center. The lines around her eyes spoke of long hours in the field and countless battles, some won, many lost, to save injured creatures that found their way into her care. Today's early morning drive wasn't part of her usual routine. The storm had downed power lines near the center, and Meredith had volunteered to check on the remote camera stations they'd set up to monitor the local bobcat population. It was a research project she'd initiated 3 years ago, tracking the declining numbers of these elusive predators as human development encroached further into their territory. The pickup's tires splashed through a deep puddle as Meredith rounded a bend in the road. Something caught her attention, a flash of movement near the creek's edge, and an unusual concentration of crows. In her decades of wildlife work, Meredith had learned to notice patterns, and a gathering of crows typically meant only one thing: something was dying. She pulled the truck onto the gravelly shoulder and cut the engine. Grabbing her field binoculars from the passenger seat, she peered through them toward the commotion. The magnified image brought clarity, and with it, a surge of adrenaline. The bobcat cub's situation became immediately apparent, as did the urgent need for intervention. Meredith hesitated only briefly, As a wildlife veterinarian, she was trained to respect nature's processes. Predation, even when difficult to witness, was part of the natural order. Yet something about this scene struck her differently. The cub wasn't merely falling prey to a natural predator. It was trapped, unable to exercise even the basic fight-or-flight response that might give it a fighting chance. And bobcats, with their numbers dwindling in this region, represented a conservation concern that Meredith couldn't ignore. She reached for her emergency field kit, a weathered leather bag that had accompanied her on countless rescues. Inside were the basic tools of her trade: gloves, antiseptic, bandages, and sedatives appropriate for various species. She pulled on her rain jacket and boots, then slid down the muddy embankment toward the creek. The crows noticed her approach immediately. Several took flight, circling overhead with indignant calls that seemed to protest her interference. Others stood their ground, reluctant to abandon their claim on such vulnerable prey. Meredith moved deliberately, careful not to slip on the rain-slick rocks that lined the creek bed. She could see now that the cub's situation was even more dire than she'd initially thought. Its head had been pecked repeatedly, and one eye was swollen shut, blood mixed with creek water on its fur, creating pale pink rivulets that disappeared into the rushing current. "Hey, get away from there!" Meredith shouted, waving her arms to scatter the remaining crows. They retreated reluctantly, hopping back a few feet before settling on nearby branches to watch the human interloper with their intelligent, calculating eyes. As Meredith drew closer, she could see the cub's chest rising and falling with rapid, shallow breaths. It was alive, but barely. Its one good eye fixed on her approach with a mixture of terror and exhaustion, too depleted even to attempt to hiss or growl. The rising water now reached its neck, another inch or two, and drowning would become the most immediate threat. Meredith crouched at the creek's edge, the icy water seeping through her boots as she assessed the situation. The fallen log where the cub was trapped had been carried downstream during the flash flood, coming to rest at an angle that created a natural dam of debris. Branches and twigs formed a tangled web that had snagged the tiny bobcat as effectively as any human-made trap. "Easy now," Meredith murmured, though she knew her words meant nothing to the terrified creature. It was her tone she hoped might soothe, a gentle constant amid the chaos of rushing water and cawing crows. She reached into her field kit and pulled out a pair of thick leather gloves. Even a young bobcat's claws and teeth could inflict serious damage if fear triggered its defensive instincts. The cub's trapped paw was wedged between two branches under the waterline. Meredith would need to partially submerge herself to free it. She glanced at the current, swift but not dangerously, so at this particular spot, taking a deep breath, she stepped carefully into the frigid water, feeling the powerful push against her legs as she braced herself on slippery rocks. A crow dived low overhead, its shadow passing over the cub. The tiny creature flinched, losing its tenuous grip on the log and slipping further into the current. Only its trapped paw kept it from being swept away entirely. Meredith lunged forward, cold water now soaking her up to her waist as she managed to cup one hand beneath the cub's body, supporting its weight. "I've got you," she said, working methodically with her free hand to examine how the paw was caught. Two branches had scissored together, pinning the delicate bones between them. The cub would never free itself, especially with its strength fading. Shifting position to brace her shoulder against the log, Meredith reached into her jacket pocket for a multi-tool she always carried. With practiced movements, she extracted the pliers and maneuvered them toward the branches. The bobcat cub hung limply in her supporting hand now, its golden eye half closed. The crows continued their protest from the trees, their calls seeming to inspire newcomers to join them. The murder was growing, now numbering nearly 20 birds whose collective attention remained fixed on the drama unfolding at the creek's edge. Meredith's fingers were growing numb in the cold water, making it difficult to manipulate the pliers. She gritted her teeth, focusing all her concentration on applying pressure to the broader branch. After what seemed an eternity, The wood gave, slightly with a soft cracking sound. She quickly wedged the tool in further and leveraged her weight against it. The branch snapped, releasing its grip on the cub's paw. Immediately, Meredith cradled the tiny body against her chest, backing carefully, out of the creek. The cub offered no resistance, a worrying sign. Its fur was saturated, making it seem even smaller than it actually was, probably no more than 3 weeks old, barely old enough to begin exploring outside the den. Too young to be separated from its mother, too young to face the brutal indifference of nature alone. As Meredith emerged from the water, the boldest of the crows swooped low, its wings nearly brushing her head. She waved it away with her free hand, turning her body to shield the cub from its persistent tormentor. "Back off," she muttered, moving quickly toward higher ground. She needed to examine the cub properly, away from the crows and the rising water. Finding a relatively dry patch beneath the spreading branches of a massive Douglas fir, Meredith knelt and gently placed the bobcat on a folded emergency blanket she pulled from her kit. The damage was immediately apparent. Beyond the obvious injury to its eye, the cub's head and face bore multiple puncture wounds from the crow's sharp beaks. Its breathing was labored, its small body trembling violently, from cold, fear, or both. The trapped paw was swollen and possibly fractured, though it wasn't bleeding. Most concerning was the cub's lethargy. Wild predators, even young ones, typically fought against human handling with every ounce of their strength. This little one's surrender spoke volumes about its depleted condition. Meredith's field training took over as she conducted a rapid assessment. Hypothermia was the most immediate threat, followed by shock and infection from the wounds. She needed to warm the cub, gradually while addressing the injuries, then make a difficult decision about what came next. Returning to her truck for supplies would mean leaving the cub vulnerable to the still-watching crows, but attempting treatment here with limited resources risked worsening its condition. The sound of an approaching vehicle interrupted her thoughts. Turning toward the road, Meredith saw a Forest Service SUV slowing to a stop beside her pickup. The driver's door opened, and a tall figure in a ranger's uniform emerged. "Dr. Tanner?" the ranger called, making his way down the embankment. "Thought, that was your truck. Everything okay down there?" Meredith recognized Kyle Blackwood, one of the newer rangers assigned to this district. In his early 30s with a PhD in conservation biology, Kyle had consulted with her on several projects since joining the service 8 months ago. "Found a bobcat cub," she replied, not looking up as she continued her examination. "Separated from its mother in the flood, I think. Crows were making a meal of it when I arrived." Kyle reached her side and crouched down, whistling softly as he took in the cub's condition. "Poor little guy's been through hell. What can I do?" "I need my emergency warming pack from the truck," Meredith said, grateful for the unexpected assistance. "Blue duffel in the back seat, and if you have a thermos of anything hot, bring that too." Kyle nodded and jogged back toward the vehicles. Meredith returned her attention to the cub, carefully cleaning the wounds on its face with antiseptic wipes from her kit. The animal offered no resistance, its eye now fully closed, its breathing shallow but steady. If she hadn't known better, Meredith might have thought it was asleep, but she recognized the dangerous stillness of a creature hovering on the edge of shutdown. "Hang in there, little fighter," she whispered, using her body to block the wind while she worked. "Help is coming." Kyle returned quickly, navigating the muddy slope with practiced ease despite the heavy duffel slung over his shoulder. The crows remained, their dark forms dotting the trees like malevolent fruit, occasionally shifting position with rustling wings and harsh calls that seemed to track the human's every movement. "Got everything," Kyle said, kneeling beside Meredith and unzipping the duffel. "And I had coffee, still hot." He unscrewed the thermos cap, releasing a cloud of fragrant steam into the damp air. Meredith nodded gratefully, extracting a chemical heating pad from the duffel. She cracked the internal pouch, activating the chemical reaction that would provide a steady, gentle warmth for the next several hours. After wrapping it in a soft towel, she carefully positioned it beneath the emergency blanket, creating a cocoon of warmth around the bobcat cub without overheating its chilled body. Direct heat could send him into shock, she explained, watching as Kyle poured a small amount of coffee into the thermos cap. We need to warm him gradually. Core first, then extremities. Kyle offered the cap. For you, not him, he clarified, with a half smile. You're soaked and it's barely 40 degrees out here. Meredith accepted the coffee gratefully, only now registering how thoroughly chilled she had become. She wrapped her fingers around the warm metal, allowing the heat to penetrate her numb hands before taking a sip. The hot liquid traced a path of warmth through her chest, momentarily displacing the cold that had settled in her bones. Thanks. I didn't realize how cold I was getting. Kyle nodded, his gaze shifting to the cub. What happened to its eye? Crow attack, Meredith said, setting down the coffee to check the cub's pulse with gentle fingers against its throat. They were taking turns pecking at it when I arrived. They're intelligent opportunists, recognized a vulnerable target and exploited it. The pulse was rapid but discernible. A good sign. Will it survive? Kyle asked, his voice low as if the cub might understand their assessment of its chances. Meredith didn't answer immediately. In her years of wildlife medicine, she'd learned to be cautious with predictions. She'd seen seemingly hopeless cases make miraculous recoveries, and promising ones take sudden, devastating turns. The young bobcat had multiple factors working against it: hypothermia, trauma, potential infection, and its age. It was likely still dependent on its mother's milk, which complicated its care requirements. Hard to say, she finally answered. The next 24 hours will tell us more. He needs antibiotics, fluid therapy, proper wound care. She trailed off, mentally calculating what was possible with the resources at the Wildlife Recovery Center. And we need to look for the mother. Cubs this young don't travel far from the den unless forced. Kyle frowned, scanning the surrounding forest. The mom's probably frantic. Bobcat females are intensely protective of their young. If she's still alive, Meredith said grimly. This flooding has disrupted the entire ecosystem. We've had reports of displaced wildlife all over the mountains since the storm hit. A subtle change in the cub's breathing caught Meredith's attention. Its little chest was rising and falling more evenly now, the warming treatment beginning to take effect. She gently palpated its abdomen, checking for signs of internal injuries. Finding none, she moved to examine the previously trapped paw. The swelling was significant, but when she carefully manipulated the joints, there was no grating sensation that would indicate broken bones. Just a bad sprain, if they were lucky. We need to get him to the center, Meredith decided, beginning to repack her supplies. I can stabilize him there, assess the full extent of his injuries under proper conditions. Kyle nodded, gathering the scattered items from her kit. I was heading up to check on the Northridge Trail anyway. Reports of downed trees blocking access. I can radio ahead. Let them know you're coming in with an emergency case. Perfect. Ask for Lisa to prepare the intensive care unit and have the incubator ready. Tell her it's a male bobcat cub, approximately 3 weeks old, with multiple traumas and hypothermia. The ranger pulled out his radio and stepped away to make the call. Meredith used the opportunity to administer a tiny dose of antibiotics from a pre-filled syringe in her emergency kit, carefully injecting it into the muscle of the cub's hindquarters. The bobcat didn't react. Not a promising sign, but not surprising given its condition. As Kyle completed the call, Meredith prepared to transport her patient. She fashioned a makeshift carrier from a storage container in her duffel, lining it with soft towels and making air holes in the lid. The warming pad went on the bottom, creating a heated nest for the traumatized cub. Ready to move him, she told Kyle as he returned. Can you help me get up to the truck? This slope is treacherous with the container. Kyle took the improvised carrier while Meredith gathered the Remaining supplies. As they turned to ascend the embankment, a cacophony of crow calls erupted from the forest around them. The birds seemed agitated, their numbers suddenly increasing as they moved restlessly among the trees. "What's got them worked up?" Kyle murmured, instinctively holding the container closer to his chest. Meredith scanned the tree line, her experienced eyes searching for the source of the disturbance. A movement in the shadows beneath a large cedar caught her attention. A tawny form, lean and powerful, with distinctive tufted ears and intent golden eyes. A female bobcat, watching them from the cover of the underbrush. The mother. Meredith breathed, placing a restraining hand on Kyle's arm as he prepared to continue up the slope. "Don't move suddenly." The female bobcat took a cautious step forward, her muscular body tense with wary purpose. She was magnificent, a perfect specimen of her species, her spotted coat blending seamlessly with the dappled forest floor. Her eyes never left the container in Kyle's hands, her keen senses undoubtedly detecting the scent of her offspring despite the human interference. "What do we do?" Kyle whispered, remaining absolutely still as the predator evaluated them from 30 feet away. Meredith's mind raced through the possibilities. The ethical approach would be to reunite mother and cub. But the cub's condition was precarious. Without medical intervention, it would likely die from its injuries and exposure. Yet separating a wild mother from her young came with its own set of moral complications. "Let me think," she murmured, watching as the female took another deliberate step forward, a low growl rumbling from her throat. The choice before Meredith was emblematic of the complex intersection between conservation ethics, wildlife medicine, and natural processes. A dilemma without a perfect answer. The female bobcat inched closer, her powerful shoulders rolling, with each cautious step. The crows above fell silent, as if collectively holding their breath at this new development. Meredith could feel Kyle's tension beside her, though to his credit, he remained perfectly still despite the natural instinct to retreat from an approaching predator. "She's not showing aggression," Meredith whispered, reading the subtle language of the wildcat's body. "She's anxious, but not preparing to attack. That's promising." "Promising for whom?" Kyle murmured through barely moving lips. "If she decides we've taken her cub?" "Bobcats rarely attack humans," Meredith reminded him, though she kept her eyes fixed on the approaching mother. "Even maternal females, they prefer avoidance." The distance had narrowed to 20 feet now, close enough for Meredith to see the bobcat's whiskers twitching as she tested the air, her pink nose flaring with each careful breath. Suddenly, a weak sound emanated from the container, a barely audible mewling as the cub stirred within its makeshift nest. The effect on the mother was immediate. Her ears swiveled forward, her body tensing with recognition. "She heard him," Kyle whispered. Meredith nodded slowly. "Put the container down," she instructed, very gently, "then back away with me." "Give her space to investigate." Kyle hesitated. "The cub needs medical attention. You said so yourself." "I know, but we need to see if reuniting them is viable. If she takes him, I can track them, provide supplemental care if needed." Bobcat mothers are exceptional caregivers. Her presence alone might improve his chances. Decision made, Kyle carefully lowered the container to the ground, removing the lid but leaving the towels and warming pad in place around the cub. Then, with deliberate slowness, he and Meredith began backing up the slope, maintaining eye contact with the wary mother. At 15 feet away, they stopped. Far enough to give the bobcat space, close enough to intervene if necessary. The female remained frozen for several long moments, her golden eyes flicking between the humans and the container. Then, with the fluid grace characteristic of her species, she approached the makeshift carrier. Meredith held her breath as the mother bobcat peered inside, her sensitive nose hovering just above her injured offspring. The cub made another weak sound, raising its small head slightly at the familiar scent. For a tense moment, Meredith thought the reunion would succeed, the natural bond between mother and child overcoming the human interference and the cub's injuries. But then the female bobcat recoiled, taking several quick steps backward. She circled the container once, then again, her body language shifting from maternal concern to something else. Uncertainty, perhaps even fear. With a final glance at the humans, she turned and disappeared into the underbrush, vanishing as completely as if she'd never been there at all. She rejected him, Kyle said, disbelief evident in his voice. Why would she do that? Meredith's expression was grim as she moved quickly back to the container. She smells the difference. Wild animals can detect illness and injury. In nature, a compromised cub might endanger the rest of her litter or attract predators to the den. She knelt beside the makeshift carrier, checking the cub's condition. It had become more responsive during the encounter, its uninjured eye now fully open and tracking movement. So what now? Kyle asked. Now we save him, Meredith said, with quiet determination, replacing the lid on the container. His mother has made her choice according to the rules of survival. We'll make ours according to the values of conservation. Together, they made their way up the muddy embankment, more urgently now that the dilemma of reunification had been resolved. The crows resumed their clamor as the humans retreated, perhaps sensing that their potential meal was being permanently removed from their territory. By the time Meredith and Kyle reached the vehicles, the container had warmed noticeably from the heating pad, and the cub had begun making more frequent vocalizations. Tiny mewls that tugged at something primal in Meredith's chest. He's more alert, she noted, settling the container securely in the passenger footwell of her truck. That's encouraging. Kyle handed her the remainder of the coffee. What will happen to him at the center? Meredith sipped the lukewarm liquid, considering her answer. Intensive supportive care for now. Fluid therapy, antibiotics, wound management. He'll need around-the-clock feeding, a special formula we use for orphaned predator cubs, if he survives the next 48 hours. She paused, allowing herself to acknowledge the challenging road ahead. Then we assess his long-term options, which are rehabilitation for eventual release if possible. But with head trauma and neurological symptoms, that pathway might be closed to him. Our goal is always to return wildlife to their natural habitat, but sometimes the injuries are too severe. Kyle's expression darkened. And if that's the case, then he either becomes an education ambassador, if his temperament allows, or she didn't finish the sentence. They both understood the ethical complexity of keeping wild predators in captivity and the difficult decisions that sometimes had to be made when rehabilitation wasn't possible. I'll follow you back to the center, Kyle offered, glancing at his watch. The trail inspection can wait a few hours. You might need help getting him settled. Meredith nodded gratefully. Thanks. The team will be prepping the ICU, but an extra pair of hands is always welcome. She closed the truck door and started the engine, adjusting the heater to maintain the warming process they'd begun by the creek. As she pulled onto the Forest Service road, Meredith glanced at the container beside her. Inside, the Bobcat Cub had curled itself against the warming pad, its injured eye crusted shut but its good one watching her with unmistakable awareness. Despite everything, the trauma, the rejection by its mother, the uncertain future, there was still a fierce spark of life in that golden gaze. I'm going to call you Ember, she decided aloud, because even when everything around you went dark and cold, that inner fire kept burning. The drive to the Pacific Northwest Wildlife Recovery Center took nearly 40 minutes, winding through mountain roads still bearing the scars of the recent flooding. Fallen trees had been hastily cleared from the main routes, but debris lined. The shoulders and streams still ran high and fast alongside the pavement. Throughout the journey, Meredith maintained a running conversation with her passenger, more for her own benefit than his. You picked quite a morning to get into trouble, Ember, she told the cub as they passed a crew repairing a washed-out section of guardrail. Half the county's infrastructure is compromised. We're running on generator power at the center, and Dr. Patel is at a conference in Seattle. It's just me and the rehab team until tomorrow. The cub responded with a weak mewl that Meredith chose to interpret as attentiveness rather than distress. His improved responsiveness was encouraging, though she remained acutely aware of how quickly conditions could change in pediatric wildlife cases. The truck's heater had fogged the windows slightly, creating a cocoon of warmth that seemed to separate them from the chaos of the storm-damaged landscape outside. You know, she continued, navigating around a particularly deep pothole. In 20 years of wildlife medicine, I've rehabilitated exactly 16 bobcats. 9 were successfully released. 4 became permanent residents at various facilities. 3 didn't make it. She paused, gripping the steering wheel a little tighter. I'm going to do everything I can to make sure you're number 10 on the release list. But whatever happens, I promise you won't be alone again. As the truck crested the final hill, the Wildlife Recovery Center came into view in the valley below. A sprawling complex of buildings and enclosures set against the backdrop of the Cascade foothills. Even from a distance, Meredith could see the generator trucks parked near the main building, temporary power cables snaking between structures. Kyle's Forest Service vehicle remained a reassuring presence in her rearview mirror as they made the final approach. The Pacific Northwest Wildlife Recovery Center hummed with subdued activity as Meredith pulled into her designated parking space. Despite the power outage affecting much of the county, the center's backup generators kept the essential systems running: life support for the critical care patients, temperature regulation for the rehabilitation enclosures, and basic lighting. Throughout the medical facilities, even in crisis mode, there was an air of quiet efficiency that Meredith had worked hard to instill during her tenure as head veterinarian. Lisa Chen, the center's senior wildlife rehabilitation specialist, was already waiting at the side entrance, a gurney prepared beside her. At 35, Lisa had been with the center almost as long as Meredith, having started as an intern fresh out of college and worked her way up to overseeing the entire rehabilitation program. Her shoulder-length black hair was pulled back in a practical ponytail, and she wore the center's standard uniform of olive green scrubs beneath a light fleece jacket. "Got your message," Lisa said as Meredith carefully lifted the container from the passenger side. "ICU 3 is prepped and waiting. How bad?" "Multiple crow attack injuries to the head and face, possible neurological damage, severe hypothermia, approximately 3 weeks old," Meredith summarized, placing the container on the gurney. "His mother rejected him when we tried reunification." Lisa's expression remained professional, but Meredith knew her well enough to spot the flicker of concern in her dark eyes. "Name?" "Ember," Meredith said, as Kyle joined them from his vehicle. "This is Ranger Blackwood. He helped with the rescue and offered to assist with the intake." Lisa nodded a greeting to Kyle as they moved through the doors into the treatment area. Unlike the main visitor center with its educational displays and viewing windows, this section of the facility was strictly functional. Polished concrete floors that could be easily sanitized, stainless steel examination tables, and specialized equipment arranged in careful order along the walls. The lighting was bright, but not harsh, designed to minimize stress for wildlife patients, while providing optimal visibility for treatment. "Temperatures up from the field, but still low," Meredith noted as she transferred Ember from the container to the examination table, keeping the warming pad beneath him. "Let's get baseline vitals before we move him to the incubator." Lisa moved, with practiced efficiency, attaching a pediatric pulse oximeter to the cub's uninjured rear paw while Meredith inserted a tiny rectal thermometer. Kyle stood back, watching the choreographed movements of the two women with quiet admiration. "Temperature 95.4, Meredith announced. "Still hypothermic, but responding to treatment." "Pulse 140, respiration 34, Lisa added, recording the numbers on a chart. "Blood oxygen 92%, low but within acceptable range given his condition." Meredith gently opened the cub's mouth to check its mucous membranes. "Pale but not white. Dehydration evident." Let's start warmed subcutaneous fluids and continue the antibiotic protocol I initiated in the field. Lisa nodded, moving to prepare the necessary treatments while Meredith conducted a more thorough examination than had been possible beside the creek. Under the bright examination lights, Ember's injuries appeared both better and worse than she'd initially assessed. The puncture wounds from the crow's beaks were numerous but relatively shallow, painful and carrying risk of infection, but not immediately life-threatening. The damage to his right eye, however, was concerning. Corneal laceration with possible anterior chamber involvement, she murmured, using an ophthalmoscope to examine the injury more closely. We may be looking at permanent vision loss in that eye. Kyle moved closer, his forehead creased with concern. Will that affect his chances of release? Potentially, Meredith acknowledged. Bobcats can adapt to partial vision loss in controlled settings, but in the wild, depth perception is crucial for hunting and survival. She continued her examination, feeling along the cub's spine and gently manipulating each limb to check for additional injuries. The good news is that the head tilt I noticed in the field is less pronounced now. Could have been disorientation from hypothermia rather than neurological damage. Lisa returned with the prepared medications and a set of tiny feeding tubes. Weight is 580 grams, she reported. That's about right for his estimated age, but he's dehydrated, so he'd normally be heavier. Let's get those fluids started, Meredith directed, accepting a syringe of warmed, lactated Ringer's solution from Lisa. With expert hands, she created a small tent of skin between Ember's shoulder blades and slowly injected the fluid, creating a visible bulge that would gradually be absorbed into his system. The cub barely reacted, his good eye blinking slowly as the procedure progressed. He's too quiet, Lisa observed, preparing a second syringe. Healthy cubs this age are vocal and resistant to handling. Agreed. But he's been through significant trauma and environmental stress. Let's reserve judgment until we've stabilized his condition and given him time to recover from the immediate crisis. Kyle cleared his throat. Is there anything I can do to help? Meredith considered for a moment. Actually, yes. We need to document everything for our records and potential case studies. Could you take some photographs of his injuries before we bandage them? There's a camera in that cabinet. While Kyle retrieved the camera, Meredith and Lisa continued their methodical work, cleaning each wound with antiseptic solution before applying a thin layer of antibiotic ointment. The injuries around Ember's damaged eye received particular attention, with Meredith applying a specialized ophthalmic preparation designed to reduce inflammation and promote healing in delicate tissues. I want to get radiographs of the skull and that sprained paw, Meredith decided as they finished treating the last of the visible wounds. And a full blood work panel once he's more stable. Lisa nodded, making notes on the treatment chart. What? About nutrition? He's definitely weaned, but probably still nursing occasionally. We'll start with diluted formula every 2 hours, gradually increasing concentration as his system stabilizes. I want to monitor his waste output closely, any signs of digestive distress, and will adjust immediately. Kyle had been quietly documenting each stage of the treatment, his Forest Service training evident in the methodical, evidence-focused approach to the photography. Now he lowered the camera, his expression thoughtful. What are his actual chances, Dr. Tanner? Realistically. Meredith paused in her work, looking down at the small creature on her examination table. In the stark medical environment, Ember appeared even more vulnerable than he had by the creek, his injuries more vivid against his clean fur, his tiny size emphasized by the adult-scaled equipment surrounding him. Yet there was something undeniably resilient in his continued responsiveness, in the steady rise and fall of his little chest, in the way his good eye tracked their movements with growing awareness. 50-50, she said finally. The next 24 hours are critical. If he makes it through the night, his odds improve significantly. If he's still with us in 3 days, I'd upgrade to cautiously optimistic. Lisa, who had been preparing the portable incubator, rejoined them at the examination table. Transport unit ready. Temperature set to gradual normalization protocol. Humidity at 70%. Together, they transferred Ember to the specialized container, positioning him on soft padding that wouldn't interfere with his body's temperature regulation. The incubator would maintain precise environmental conditions while allowing continuous monitoring through its clear sides. Meredith adjusted the oxygen flow, not quite therapeutic concentration, but enriched enough to reduce the workload on Ember's compromised system. "Let's move him to ICU 3, she directed, as Lisa secured the portable unit for transport. "I want continuous vital monitoring and someone with eyes on him at all times for the first 12 hours. "I've got Marina coming in early," Lisa said, referring to one of their most experienced wildlife care technicians. "Between us, we can cover the shifts until tomorrow morning. Do you want me to call in additional staff?" Meredith shook her head. "Not yet. Let's see how he responds to initial treatment. No point exhausting our resources if—" She didn't finish the sentence. After 2 decades in wildlife medicine, she maintained a careful balance between investment in each patient and emotional self-preservation. Too much detachment, and she risked missing subtle signs that might improve an animal's chances. Too much attachment, and she couldn't function effectively when difficult decisions became necessary. Kyle helped them navigate the incubator through the doorway and down the corridor to the intensive care unit, a specialized room designed for the center's most critical patients. Unlike the general treatment areas, ICU 3 was designed specifically for small mammals, with additional sound insulation to minimize stress and specialized monitoring equipment scaled for patients under 5 kilograms. As they settled Ember into his carefully controlled environment, Meredith felt the familiar mixture of professional satisfaction and emotional guardedness that accompanied every wildlife admission. She had done everything possible for the initial stabilization. Now it was a matter of monitoring, adjusting, treatment as needed, and something less tangible. The individual will to survive that varied so dramatically from patient to patient. "I should get back to my patrol route," Kyle said reluctantly, watching as Lisa programmed the automated monitoring system. "Will you keep me updated on his progress?" "Of course," Meredith assured him. "And thank you for your help today. Having you there made a significant difference." Kyle nodded, his gaze lingering on the tiny form visible through the incubator's clear panel. "There's something special about him, isn't there? The way he hung on despite everything. Every wild creature has that drive," Meredith replied. Though she understood what Kyle meant, some patients did seem to possess an extraordinary resilience, a determination that transcended biological imperatives. Whether Ember was one of those remained to be seen, but she couldn't deny feeling a particular investment in his outcome. After Kyle departed, Meredith stayed beside the incubator, watching as the monitoring equipment established baseline readings on Ember's vital signs. The gentle hum of the machines created a soothing background to the otherwise quiet room. Through the clear panel, she could see that the Bobcat Cub had finally surrendered to exhaustion, his small body curled into the instinctive sleeping position of his species, nose tucked beside tail. "First hurdle cleared," Lisa commented softly, joining Meredith at the incubator. "He's stable enough to sleep," Meredith nodded, allowing herself the smallest margin of optimism. "Now we wait." The next 18 hours unfolded in a rhythm familiar to anyone who has maintained a bedside vigil. Meredith divided her time between Ember's intensive care unit and the center's other patients, whose needs continued despite the crisis that had brought the Bobcat Cub into their care. Every 2 hours, she returned to ICU 3 to administer medications, check vital signs, and attempt feedings with the specialized formula. Lisa and Marina maintained similar rotations, ensuring that someone was monitoring Ember's condition at all times. Progress came in small increments. By evening, his temperature had stabilized at 99.2 degrees, still slightly below normal for a Bobcat Cub, but no longer dangerously hypothermic. His hydration improved steadily as the subcutaneous fluids were absorbed into his system, and the first 2 feedings, though minimal in volume, stayed down. Most encouraging was his gradually increasing responsiveness. Weak attempts to pull away during examinations, soft vocalizations when handled, and brief periods of alertness between stretches of exhausted sleep. "He's fighting," Marina observed during the 10 p.m. feeding. At 26, she was the youngest of the center's full-time staff, but her intuitive understanding of wildlife behavior had made her an invaluable team member. Her copper-colored hair was pulled back in a messy bun, and smudges of exhaustion darkened the skin beneath her eyes after the long day. "Look at how he's tracking movement with his good eye. That's awareness, not just reflex." Meredith nodded, carefully recording the amount of formula Ember had accepted. 14 milliliters, nearly double what he'd taken at the previous feeding. Neurological responses are improving. The head tilt is almost gone, which suggests it was primarily from shock and hypothermia rather than permanent damage. "What about his eye?" Marina asked, gently cleaning Ember's face with a warm compress after the feeding. "Too soon to say definitively. The corneal laceration is concerning, but juvenile tissues have remarkable regenerative capacity." Meredith checked the tiny bandage covering the injury. "We'll know more when Dr. Patel can examine him tomorrow. She's our ophthalmology consultant." After completing Ember's care, Meredith insisted that Lisa and Marina both go home to rest. "I'll take the overnight shift," she told them, overriding their protests with the authority of her position. "The generator crew got main power restored an hour ago, and the other patients are stable. I'll be fine." Once alone with Ember, Meredith settled into the reclining chair they kept in the ICU for exactly these situations. The room was dimly lit, now just enough illumination for monitoring without disturbing the natural circadian rhythms that were important even in critical care. Through the clear panel of the incubator, she could see the gentle rise and fall of Ember's bandaged chest, the monitoring equipment casting a soft blue glow across his tawny fur. "Just you and me now," she murmured, adjusting the blanket she'd draped across her legs. Despite the return of electrical power, the center remained cool, a deliberate choice to conserve energy and match the natural temperatures that most of their patients were adapted to. "Think we can both make it through the night without any excitement?" Ember shifted slightly in his sleep, one tiny paw twitching in response to some dream stimulus. Meredith smiled, reminded of how similar the basic neurological patterns were across mammalian species. What did bobcat cubs dream about? Their mother's warmth? The excitement of first explorations outside the den? Or were his dreams darker now, filled with the memory of rushing water and attacking crows? The night deepened around them, the sounds of the center settling into the quiet hum of essential equipment and occasional calls from the outdoor rehabilitation enclosures. Meredith maintained her vigil, dozing intermittently between embers. Scheduled treatments, her body accustomed to the fragmented sleep patterns of emergency medicine. Each time she woke, her first glance was toward the incubator, relief washing through her when the monitors showed stable vital signs. At 2:17 a.m., an alarm shattered the peaceful rhythm of the night, not the urgent screech of a critical monitor, but the more measured tone of a parameter drifting outside acceptable ranges. Meredith was fully alert instantly, crossing to the incubator before she'd even fully processed the source of the alarm. The oxygen saturation monitor was flashing yellow, not critically low, but declining steadily. "Ember?" she called softly, peering through the clear panel. The cub was awake, his good eye wide, his breathing visibly more rapid than it had been an hour before. Meredith quickly opened the incubator, reaching for her stethoscope to listen directly to his chest. The rapid, shallow quality of his respiration was immediately apparent, as was the slight whistling sound on inhalation. "Respiratory distress," she muttered, her mind rapidly assessing possible causes. Pulmonary edema from the near drowning? Pneumonia developing despite the antibiotics? Reaction to medication? or simply mucus accumulation in the compromised patient. Whatever the cause, the situation required immediate intervention. Meredith adjusted the oxygen flow to a higher concentration, then gently lifted Ember into position for chest physiotherapy, a delicate procedure in such a small patient, but necessary to clear the airways. With practiced fingers, she performed a series of light percussions over his ribcage, followed by positional drainage to help mobilize any secretions. Throughout the procedure, she spoke to him continuously, her voice low and reassuring despite the concern she couldn't entirely mask. "Easy now, little fighter. Just help me clear those airways. That's it, good cub." After several tense minutes, Ember produced a small cough, followed by visible improvement in his breathing pattern. The oxygen saturation numbers began to climb back toward acceptable levels, though they remained lower than Meredith would have liked. She continued the therapy for another 10 minutes, then carefully returned him to the incubator in a slightly elevated position to facilitate easier breathing. "I think we need to be more aggressive with the pulmonary support," she told him, adjusting the monitoring parameters to provide earlier warning if his condition deteriorated again. "Those lungs took more damage in the flood than I initially assessed." She moved to the medication cabinet, reviewing the options available for pediatric wildlife patients with respiratory compromise. The balancing act was delicate. Too little. Intervention and Ember might develop pneumonia. Too much medication and his immature systems could be overwhelmed by side effects. After careful consideration, she prepared a nebulizer treatment with a mild bronchodilator and mucolytic agent, attaching the delivery system to the incubator's oxygen port. As the fine mist began to circulate within the controlled environment, Meredith documented the episode and her response in Ember's treatment record. The clinical language, transient hypoxemia responsive to physiotherapy and bronchodilator therapy, seemed inadequate to capture the tension of those moments when his breathing had faltered, or the profound relief when he responded to treatment. By 3 a.m., the crisis had passed. Ember's oxygen saturation had stabilized at 96%. His respiratory rate had returned to acceptable parameters, and he had fallen back into an exhausted sleep. Meredith, too wired from the emergency to rest, used the time to review the latest research on pulmonary support in neonatal wild felids, making notes for adjustments to his treatment protocol. Dawn found her still awake, watching the first gray light filter through the ICU's small window as she completed Ember's 6 a.m. assessment. The night's respiratory episode had clearly taxed his limited reserves. He was less responsive this morning, accepting only half the formula volume he'd managed the previous evening. But his vital signs remained stable, and the lung sounds were clearer than they had been during the night. "Tough session, wasn't it?" she murmured, gently stroking his head with one gloved finger after completing the examination. "But you got through it. That's what matters." Lisa arrived at 7:30, her expression shifting from professional greeting to concern as she registered Meredith's exhausted appearance. "What happened?" "Respiratory episode around 2 a.m., Meredith explained, walking her colleague through the night's events and the adjustments she'd made to Ember's care plan. "I'm thinking the near drowning did more damage than our initial assessment captured. We need to monitor his lung function very closely." Lisa nodded, reviewing the treatment notes. "You look dead on your feet, Mer. Dr. Patel's flying in at noon. Why don't you go home, get some real sleep, and come back for her assessment?" Meredith hesitated, looking back at the incubator where Ember had settled after his morning treatment. The suggestion was reasonable. She was exhausted, and her effectiveness would be compromised if she didn't rest. Yet the bond forged through. The critical night made it difficult to contemplate leaving him, even in Lisa's capable hands. "I'll take care of him," Lisa promised, recognizing the reluctance in her colleague's posture. "Marina will be here in 30 minutes. We'll document everything and call you immediately if there's any change." Finally, Meredith nodded. "All right. But call me when Dr. Patel arrives. I want to be here for her assessment regardless." She gathered her belongings slowly, providing Lisa with a few final instructions before making her way toward the exit. At the door, she paused for one last look at the ICU. Morning sunlight now streamed through the window, casting a warm glow over the medical equipment and softening the clinical atmosphere of the room. Within his incubator, Ember slept peacefully, his tiny form rising and falling with each breath, stronger than yesterday, though still fragile. "Still fighting. See you in a few hours, little one," she whispered, and quietly closed the door behind her. Meredith's home was a small craftsman-style cottage nestled at the edge of a protected woodland, 15 minutes from the wildlife center. She had purchased it primarily for the location. The 2-acre property backed directly onto state forest land, providing a buffer of natural habitat that attracted a diversity of wildlife to her carefully maintained native gardens. Today, however, she barely noticed the spring wildflowers blooming along her walkway or the Steller's jay scolding from the Douglas fir near her porch. She managed to shower before exhaustion overtook her, collapsing onto her bed still wrapped in a towel, her damp hair soaking the pillow. Sleep claimed her instantly, deep and dreamless for the first few hours. Later, her rest grew fitful, populated by fragmented images of rushing water and circling crows, of golden eyes watching from the forest shadows, of tiny lungs struggling for air beneath her hands. The harsh trill of her phone dragged her back to consciousness. For a disorienting moment, she couldn't place the sound or remember why anxiety spiked through her body at its ring. Then awareness returned in a rush, and she fumbled for the device on her nightstand. "Tanner," she answered, voice rough with sleep as she squinted at the bedside clock. 11:42 a.m. She'd been asleep for just over 3 hours. "It's Lisa. Dr. Patel's flight landed early. She's already examining Ember." Meredith was fully alert instantly. "How is he?" "Stable. The respiratory issues haven't recurred, but he's still not taking optimal nutrition volumes. Dr. Patel's primary concern is the eye injury." "I'll be there in 15, Meredith said, already moving to her closet. She made it in 12, hair still damp and pulled back in a hasty ponytail, dressed in clean scrubs she kept in her go-bag for emergency shifts. The center's parking lot was busier now, staff and volunteers having reported for their regular duties despite the recent power outage. Meredith nodded greetings as she made her way swiftly to ICU 3, where she found Dr. Sanjana Patel bent over the examination table, Ember positioned carefully beneath a specialized ophthalmoscope. Dr. Patel straightened as Meredith entered, adjusting her tortoiseshell glasses with practiced precision. At 49, she was one of the most respected wildlife ophthalmologists in the country, dividing her time between 3 major rehabilitation centers in the Pacific Northwest, and maintaining a busy consulting practice that took her across the continent for particularly challenging cases. "Meredith," she greeted with a warm smile that didn't entirely mask her professional concern. "Your little patient here has quite the story, I understand. Lisa was filling me in." "Sanjana, thanks for coming directly from the airport." Meredith moved to the examination table, noting that Ember appeared alert despite the stress of handling, his good eye tracking her approach with clear recognition. "How bad is the eye injury?" Dr. Patel's expression grew serious. "Let me show you." She adjusted the ophthalmoscope, gesturing for Meredith to look through it. "The corneal laceration is deep, extending into the anterior chamber. There's traumatic uveitis, hyphema, and possible lens involvement." Meredith examined the damaged eye carefully through the specialized equipment. The injury was indeed severe, the delicate structures of the eye showing significant disruption beneath the partially healed surface laceration. "Prognosis? For vision in that eye?" "Poor to guarded." Dr. Patel gently manipulated the tissue around the injury, checking for response. "There's still some pupillary reflex, which is promising, but the internal damage is extensive. In a domestic cat, I'd recommend surgery. In a wild Bobcat Cub..." She let the sentence hang, the ethical complexities understood between the 2 experienced wildlife professionals. Meredith nodded slowly, straightening from the ophthalmoscope. The situation presented one of the fundamental dilemmas of wildlife medicine, balancing the welfare of the individual animal against the realities of what constituted a successful rehabilitation outcome. Extensive medical interventions might save Ember's eye, but if those interventions created imprinting or habituation that prevented his eventual release, would they truly be in his best interest? What are our non-surgical options? She asked. Finally, aggressive topical and systemic anti-inflammatories, specialized antibiotics to prevent further infection, and protective measures to allow maximum natural healing. Dr. Patel reached for a tablet, pulling up reference images of similar cases she had treated. I've had some success with this protocol in other wild felids with corneal injuries. The vision won't be perfect, but functional improvement is possible, especially in juveniles with their enhanced healing capacity. And if we pursued surgical intervention, microsurgery to repair the cornea, possibly including tissue grafting. Multiple procedures under general anesthesia followed by weeks of intensive postoperative care, significantly higher risk of imprinting and stress-related complications. Dr. Patel's expression was sympathetic but realistic, and with no guarantee of substantially better visual outcome than the conservative approach, given the extent of internal damage. Meredith ran a hand through her still damp hair, considering the options. Let's start with the conservative protocol. If he shows signs of pain or deterioration, we can reevaluate. I agree, Dr. Patel said, returning her attention to Ember, who had remained surprisingly calm throughout their discussion. I've brought the specialized medications with me. We can begin treatment immediately, and I'll train your team on the application techniques before I leave tomorrow. Lisa, who had been quietly observing from beside the incubator, stepped forward. What about his overall rehabilitation prospects? Can a bobcat with limited vision in one eye survive in the wild? It was the question hovering beneath their entire discussion, the one that would ultimately determine Ember's future. Meredith had seen wildlife rehabilitators and veterinarians become divided over such cases, some advocating for extensive medical intervention regardless of release potential, others arguing that euthanasia was more humane than a lifetime in captivity for creatures evolved for freedom. It depends, Meredith answered carefully. Some predators adapt remarkably well to partial vision loss. They compensate with their other highly developed senses, hearing, smell, whisker sensitivity. But it requires an extended rehabilitation period with specialized training to ensure they can hunt effectively despite the impairment. Dr. Patel nodded. I've followed several cases of one-eyed raptors that returned successfully to the wild. The key factors were age at injury, quality of rehabilitation, and release habitat selection. Young animals with proper support can develop impressive compensatory skills. So there's hope, Lisa said, her expression brightening. There's possibility, Meredith corrected gently. But we need to be realistic about the challenges. Beyond the eye injury, we're still monitoring for neurological damage, respiratory complications, and developmental issues from his traumatic experience and separation from his mother. She glanced down at Ember, who had begun to exhibit signs of stress from the prolonged handling, increased respiratory rate, subtle tension in his small body. Let's continue this discussion while we get him settled back in the incubator. He's reaching his tolerance threshold. With practiced coordination, the three women transferred Ember to his controlled environment, adjusting his position and reconnecting the monitoring equipment. Dr. Patel administered the first dose of the specialized ophthalmic medication, demonstrating the proper application technique while Meredith and Lisa observed. Throughout the procedure, she maintained a running commentary on the expected healing progression and potential complications to watch for. I'll write up the complete protocol for your records, she concluded, carefully closing the incubator once Ember was comfortably settled. And I'd like daily photo documentation of the eye for at least the first week. I can consult remotely once I'm back in Seattle. We appreciate it, Sanjana, Meredith said sincerely. Your expertise makes an enormous difference in cases like this. Dr. Patel smiled, the professional distance softening. "He's a fighter, your little Ember. I've treated enough wildlife to recognize that special resilience in certain patients, the ones that surprise us all." She glanced at the incubator, where Ember had already begun to drift toward sleep, the stress of examination and the effects of medication taking their toll on his limited energy reserves. "Keep me updated. I'm invested now." After Dr. Patel departed, to examine several other patients at the center, Meredith and Lisa remained in ICU 3, reviewing the modified treatment plan and adjusting the care schedule to accommodate the new medications. The atmosphere between them was reflective, both processing the implications of the ophthalmologist's assessment. "You never said what happened with his mother," Lisa ventured eventually. "You mentioned she rejected him, but not why." Meredith sighed, the memory of that moment by the creek still vivid despite her exhaustion. "She came looking for him, found us when we were preparing to transport him here. I hoped she would take him back, that the maternal bond would overcome the human interference. But she sensed something wrong. The injury, the illness, I don't know exactly what triggered it. She approached, recognized him as hers, then made the evolutionary calculation that all wild mothers face: risk everything for a compromised offspring, or cut losses and focus on survival." Meredith's voice held no judgment, only a biologist's understanding of nature's harsh efficiencies. She made her choice according to the rule book written into her DNA over thousands of generations. We made ours according to different values. Lisa considered this, her gaze resting on the sleeping cub. Neither choice was wrong. "No." Meredith agreed quietly. "Just different frameworks for determining what constitutes the greater good. Survival of the individual versus survival of the species. Human compassion versus natural selection." The philosophical weight of their work hung in the air between them. The constant navigation of the boundary between intervention and interference, between saving a life and altering the natural order. It was a balance that each wildlife professional had to find for themselves. A personal ethical equation with variables that shifted with each case, each patient, each outcome. "Speaking of different frameworks," Lisa said, breaking the contemplative silence, "your Forest Service ranger has called twice for updates. Should I tell him you'll call him back, or would you prefer I fill him in?" Meredith felt an unexpected warmth rise to her cheeks, which she attributed to simple exhaustion rather than any particular reaction to Kyle's continued interest in Ember's case. "I'll call him," she decided, checking the time. "But first I need to review the test results from this morning and prepare for the afternoon feeding. Can you ask Marina to assist? I want to try a different formula concentration since he's still not taking adequate volumes." Lisa nodded, recognizing both the professional necessity and the subtle deflection in Meredith's response. With a knowing smile that her colleague studiously ignored, she headed for the door. "I'll send her in. And, Mur? He seems like one of the good ones." "The cub?" Meredith asked innocently, busying herself with Ember's chart. "The ranger," Lisa clarified with a soft laugh, and closed the door gently behind her. Left alone with her sleeping patient, Meredith allowed herself a moment to acknowledge the complex emotions of the past 24 hours. The fear during the rescue, the triumph of initial stabilization, the vigilance of the night's crisis, the measured hope of Dr. Patel's assessment, and perhaps, beneath it all, the unexpected connection with a Forest Service ranger who had demonstrated genuine compassion for a tiny wild creature that many would have deemed insignificant in the greater scheme of things. She moved to the incubator, studying Ember's peaceful form through the clear panel. "Complicated little life you've got now," she told him softly. "But we're doing our best to give you every chance." The next 3 days established a new rhythm at the Wildlife Recovery Center. Ember's condition stabilized enough to move him from the incubator to a specialized neonatal enclosure, still temperature-controlled and monitored, but designed to provide more space and enrichment as he began showing signs of increased strength and awareness. The respiratory issues hadn't recurred, though Meredith maintained the nebulizer treatments as a precaution. Most encouraging was his improving appetite. By the third day, he was eagerly consuming the full recommended volume of formula at each, feeding, his tiny body beginning to fill out as proper nutrition replaced the reserves depleted by his ordeal. Dr. Patel's ophthalmic protocol appeared to be having positive effects as well. The swelling around Ember's injured eye had subsided significantly, and though the damage remained evident, there were promising signs of healing in the external tissues. Whether any functional vision would return remained uncertain, but the immediate risk of infection or further deterioration had been largely resolved. Meredith maintained her direct involvement in every aspect of Ember's care, despite the increasing demands of the center's other patients. The spring season always brought an influx of wildlife requiring attention. Orphaned fawns separated from their mothers during illegal logging operations, waterfowl affected by pollution in storm runoff, the usual assortment of injured raptors, and small mammals that found their way to the facility through their network of volunteer transporters. Yet she made time for each of Ember's feedings during her shifts, using those moments to assess his development and adjust his care plan accordingly. On the morning of the fourth day, Meredith arrived at the center earlier than usual, eager to implement the next phase of Ember's rehabilitation. She found Marina already in the neonatal care unit, completing his morning assessment. "Someone's feeling much better," Marina reported, smiling as Ember attempted to climb the side of his enclosure, his movements still somewhat uncoordinated but remarkably improved from the near-lifeless state in which he'd arrived. "He actually hissed at me when I checked his temperature. First proper bobcat attitude we've seen." Meredith couldn't suppress her own smile at this development. In wildlife rehabilitation, defensive behaviors were often celebrated as positive signs. Evidence that the animal retained its wild instincts despite human intervention. That's exactly what I was hoping to hear. "I think it's time to implement minimal contact protocols." Marina nodded, understanding immediately. For wild predators especially, limiting direct human interaction was crucial to preventing imprinting, or habituation that could compromise their eventual release. What about his feedings? He still needs frequent nutrition. "We'll switch to remote feeding techniques," Meredith explained, opening a storage cabinet to retrieve specialized equipment. "The feeding syringe attaches here, allowing us to provide formula without direct handling or face-to-face contact." She demonstrated the device, essentially a long tube with a specialized nipple at one end that could be inserted through the enclosure wall. It's not ideal compared to natural feeding from mother's milk, but it maintains the distance necessary to prevent him from associating humans with food and comfort. The implementation of these protocols marked a significant milestone in Ember's journey, the transition from critical patient to rehabilitation candidate. It represented both progress and a new set of challenges. While his immediate medical needs were becoming less acute, the complex process of preparing a singleton predator cub for eventual release was just beginning. "We should also introduce appropriate developmental enrichment," Meredith continued, retrieving a box of specialized items designed specifically for young bobcats. Natural materials only, nothing synthetic that might create inappropriate associations. "And will begin limited exposure to the scents and sounds of his natural prey species." Marina watched as Meredith carefully selected several items. A section of deer hide complete with fur, preserved maple and oak leaves that crackled naturally underfoot, a small branch with intact bark for claw maintenance. This early? He's still so young. Precisely why we need to start now. In the wild, he would be learning these associations from his mother daily, observing her behaviors and developing his instinctual responses. Without that guidance, we need to provide carefully structured alternatives. Meredith's expression grew more serious. Otherwise, we risk raising a bobcat that looks wild, but lacks the fundamental skills and instincts necessary for survival. As they prepared to modify Ember's enclosure with the new enrichment items, the door to the neonatal unit opened, and Lisa entered, accompanied by Kyle Blackwood. The Forest Service ranger was dressed in his official uniform, apparently on duty, though the small potted plant he carried suggested his visit wasn't entirely professional. "Look who stopped by to check on our little survivor," Lisa announced, her tone carrying a hint of the same knowing quality that had colored her previous comments about Kyle's interest. Meredith straightened, brushing a strand of hair behind her ear in a gesture that immediately annoyed her for its unconscious femininity. "Ranger Blackwood, good morning." "Dr. Tanner," he replied with equal formality, though his warm smile suggested he wasn't fooled by the professional distance. "I brought something for Ember's enclosure. Lisa mentioned you were beginning environmental enrichment, and I thought, this might help." He held out the plant, a small pot of native woodland moss, its vibrant green surface dotted with tiny spring flowers. "It's sword fern and Oregon oxalis, collected from the area near where we found him. I thought familiar scents might be comforting, or at least useful for his sensory development." The thoughtfulness of the gesture caught Meredith off guard. Most people, even those with good intentions, didn't understand the nuances of wildlife rehabilitation well enough to select appropriate enrichment materials. That Kyle had considered not just Ember's comfort, but his developmental needs, and the importance of native scents showed an unexpected depth of understanding. "That's actually perfect," she admitted, accepting the pot and examining the healthy plants. "We try to incorporate elements from the patient's native habitat whenever possible, especially for scent imprinting." "Thank you." Kyle's expression brightened at her approval. "How's he doing? Your updates have been encouraging, but I wanted to see for myself." Meredith gestured toward the enclosure, where Ember had abandoned his climbing attempts and was now investigating a new toy, a specialized ball that dispensed tiny amounts of formula when manipulated correctly, encouraging natural problem-solving behaviors. "See for yourself. He's making remarkable progress." Kyle moved closer to the enclosure, careful to maintain the distance protocol that Lisa had apparently briefed him on. His expression reflected genuine wonder as he observed the Bobcat Cub's transformation from the half-drowned crow-pecked victim they'd rescued just days before. "That's amazing. I barely recognize him." "Young wildlife have incredible resilience when given appropriate support," Meredith explained, finding herself warming to Kyle's evident enthusiasm despite her usual professional reserve. "Their bodies are designed for rapid growth and adaptation. What would be a catastrophic injury for an adult can sometimes be just a temporary setback for a juvenile." "What about his eye?" Kyle asked, noticing the still evident damage despite the improvement. "Dr. Patel is cautiously optimistic about partial recovery. He'll likely have significantly reduced vision in that eye, but bobcats rely heavily on their other senses for hunting, hearing and smell in particular. With proper rehabilitation, he can develop compensatory skills." The conversation was interrupted by a soft, electronic chime from the monitoring system, indicating that Ember's scheduled feeding time had arrived. Marina moved to prepare the formula while Meredith began setting up the remote feeding apparatus, their coordinated actions demonstrating the practiced routine they'd established. "I should let you get back to work," Kyle said, stepping back to give them space. "I just wanted to drop off the plants and see how he was doing." "You're welcome to stay and observe the feeding," Meredith offered, surprising herself with the invitation. "It might give you more insight into our rehabilitation protocols. For your professional knowledge," she added, perhaps too quickly. Kyle's barely suppressed smile suggested he recognized the qualification for what it was, but he accepted with genuine interest. "I'd like that, if I'm not in the way." "Not at all," Lisa assured him, exchanging a glance with Marina that Meredith studiously ignored. "In fact, why don't I give you a proper tour of the facility afterward? We can show you some of our other rehabilitation cases and explain our release protocols." As Marina finished preparing the formula and transferring it to the specialized feeding syringe, Meredith positioned the device through a small port in Ember's enclosure. The Bobcat Cub had learned the association quickly. At the sight of the feeding apparatus, he approached with increasing confidence, his whiskers twitching as he detected the scent of the nutritious formula. We maintain complete silence during feedings, Meredith explained quietly to Kyle. No eye contact, no reassuring noises that might create human associations. As far as possible, we want the experience to be about the food itself, not about us. They watched in silence as Ember latched onto the specialized nipple and began to nurse vigorously, his small paws kneading instinctively against the enclosure floor, a natural behavior that would normally be directed at his mother's body during nursing. Despite his injuries and traumatic beginning, these innate actions remained intact, offering hope that the fundamental wildness at his core had survived his ordeal. When the feeding was complete, Meredith carefully withdrew the apparatus without any acknowledgement of Ember's presence. The cub, seemingly satisfied, began grooming himself with methodical concentration, another encouraging sign of normal development. "That's remarkable," Kyle said once they had moved a sufficient distance from the enclosure to resume conversation. "The whole process seems so methodical, every detail considered." "It has to be," Meredith replied, cleaning the feeding equipment with practiced efficiency. "The margin for error with predator species is particularly narrow. Release a herbivore with slightly inadequate wild skills, and it might still manage to survive by grazing. Release a predator without proper hunting abilities, and you've essentially condemned it to starvation," Kyle finished soberly. "Exactly. Which is why the next phase of Ember's rehabilitation will be the most challenging and the most critical for his future." Lisa rejoined them, having stepped out briefly to handle another matter. "Speaking of challenges, the county wildlife officer just called. They've received reports of another bobcat cub sighting near Whispering Creek, not far from where you found Ember." Meredith's attention sharpened immediately. "A second cub? Alive?" "Apparently." A hiker reported hearing what sounded like bobcat vocalizations coming from a hollow log near the creek bend. Given the recent flooding and the proximity to where Ember was found, it could be a sibling, Meredith concluded, her mind racing with the implications. Bobcats typically had litters of 2 to 4 cubs, meaning Ember almost certainly had siblings. If another cub had survived the flooding and maternal separation, the mother might have retrieved one cub but couldn't find Ember. Kyle was already checking his service radio. "I can have a team check it out immediately. If there's another cub in distress, I'm coming with you," Meredith interrupted, her tone brooking no argument. If it is a sibling, having both cubs together would dramatically improve their rehabilitation prospects. Social learning between littermates is a crucial component of normal development. The potential discovery energized everyone in the room. For Ember, a sibling would mean not just companionship, but a rehabilitation partner, someone from whom he could learn natural bobcat behaviors without the risky influence of human imprinting. For the rehabilitation team, it would significantly increase the chances of successful release for both cubs. "Marina, prep the transport unit and an emergency medical kit," Meredith directed, already moving toward the door. "Lisa, you're in charge until we return. Maintain Ember's schedule exactly as planned. Don't delay any treatments in anticipation of a potential sibling." Kyle was already on his radio, coordinating with other rangers to secure the reported location until they arrived. "Central, this is Ranger Blackwood. I need a team to secure the area around the creek bend on Whispering Creek Trail. Possible endangered wildlife situation. Dr. Tanner from the Wildlife Recovery Center and I are en route, ETA 30 minutes. As they prepared for the urgent mission, Meredith cast a final glance at Ember's enclosure. The bobcat cub had finished his grooming and was now exploring the new enrichment items, particularly interested in the deer hide that carried the scent of a natural prey species. His movements were stronger, more coordinated than they had been even a day before, evidence of his remarkable recovery. "Hang in there, little one," she whispered, too softly for the others to hear. "We might be bringing you a friend." The Forest Service truck navigated the winding mountain roads with urgent purpose. Kyle's expert handling guiding the vehicle around debris still scattered from the recent flooding. Beside him, Meredith sat with the emergency kit secured on her lap, mentally reviewing protocols for field assessment of potentially injured wildlife. In the back seat, Marina had positioned the transport carrier and additional medical supplies, her usual cheerful demeanor replaced by focused preparation. "The hiker who reported the sounds is meeting us at the trailhead," Kyle explained as they turned onto the narrow access road that led to Whispering Creek Trail. Environmental science student from the community college, he recognized the vocalizations as a felid, though he wasn't certain it was specifically a bobcat. "Did he attempt to locate the source?" Meredith asked, concern edging her voice. Well-intentioned civilians often did more harm than good when encountering wildlife in distress, their desire to help sometimes resulting in additional trauma or dangerous maternal separation. Negative. He followed proper protocol. Maintained. Distance, noted the location, and called it in immediately. Said he'd been attending your wildlife awareness workshops at the college. Meredith nodded with grudging approval. The educational outreach programs she conducted throughout the community often seemed like a distraction from her clinical work, but moments like this validated their importance. Good. The last thing we need is someone trying to rescue a bobcat cub that the mother might be actively searching for. The trailhead parking area came into view, a small gravel lot currently occupied by 2 other Forest Service vehicles and a modest blue sedan that presumably belonged to the reporting hiker. As Kyle brought the truck to a stop, Meredith could see a small group gathered near the trailhead sign. 2 uniformed rangers and a young man with a backpack who appeared to be describing something with animated hand gestures. "That's Theo Richardson," Marina said, recognizing the student as they approached. "He volunteers at the educational center sometimes, serious about conservation work." The young man turned as they joined the group, his expression brightening. "With recognition. Dr. Tanner, I was hoping they'd send you." The sounds were definitely feline, coming from about a quarter mile up the trail near the Big Creek Bend. Sort of a high-pitched mewling, but with this distinctive churring quality that made me think bobcat rather than domestic. "Good observation," Meredith acknowledged, appreciating his precise description. "How long ago did you hear it last?" "About 90 minutes. I was doing water quality sampling for my environmental assessment class when I heard it. Seemed distressed, but not weakening or changing pitch over the time I observed." One of the other rangers, Peterson, according to his name badge, stepped forward with a topographical map spread on the hood of his vehicle. "We've marked the approximate location based on Theo's description. It's just beyond where the trail crosses the tributary stream in this stand of older growth." His finger indicated a densely forested area near where the creek curved sharply around a rocky outcropping. "Any sign of adult bobcats in the area?" Kyle asked, studying the map. "None reported recently," Peterson replied. "But given the flooding and resulting wildlife displacement, normal territorial patterns have been disrupted throughout the region." Meredith considered this information, weighing the possibilities against what they already knew about Ember's rescue. If this was indeed a sibling, the mother might have retrieved it from the floodwaters, but been unable to move it back to the original den site, perhaps establishing a temporary shelter in the hollow log mentioned in the report. Alternatively, the cub might have been separated during the same event that had swept Ember downstream, managing to find shelter but now abandoned. "We need to approach carefully," she decided. "If the mother is nearby, our presence could drive her away permanently. Marina and I will assess from a distance first, using the observation equipment. The rest of you should establish a perimeter at least 50 yards back from the reported location." Kyle nodded, immediately coordinating with the other rangers to establish the containment protocol. As a group, they moved up the trail, keeping conversation to a minimum and stepping carefully on the muddy path. The recent flooding had altered the familiar landscape. Uprooted saplings leaned at awkward angles, debris hung from branches well above the normal waterline, and the creek itself had carved new channels through what had previously been undergrowth. After 15 minutes of hiking, They reached the tributary crossing, now a washed-out area where the normally placid stream had overflowed its banks, carrying away the small footbridge that had once spanned it. Kyle signaled for the main group to hold position, while Meredith and Marina continued forward, moving with the cautious deliberation of experienced wildlife observers. The hollow log described in the report was visible about 30 yards ahead, a massive fallen Douglas fir, its root system partially exposed by the floodwaters that had undermined the surrounding soil. The trunk, at least 4 feet in diameter, lay partially across a newly formed channel where the creek had diverted during the flooding. From their position, Meredith could see that the far end of the log had broken open, creating a natural shelter elevated just above the water level. "Perfect emergency den," she murmured to Marina as they settled behind a screen of salal bushes to observe. "Elevated, defensible entrance, protected from the elements." Marina nodded, carefully assembling the parabolic microphone that would allow them to detect sounds from the log without approaching further. If a cub was separated but mobile, instinct would drive it to seek exactly this kind of shelter. For several long minutes, they maintained complete silence, the microphone directed toward the fallen tree, while Meredith scanned the surrounding area through high-powered binoculars. The forest was unnaturally quiet. Even the birds seemed subdued in the aftermath of the storm's disruption. Then, faintly but distinctly, the microphone captured a sound that made both women freeze in recognition. "That's a bobcat cub," Marina whispered, her expression brightening. "Same vocalization pattern as Ember's, but stronger." Meredith nodded, adjusting the binoculars to focus more precisely on the log's opening. A slight movement caught her attention. A tiny paw briefly visible at the entrance before withdrawing into the shadows. "Visual confirmation," she said quietly. "Definitely a bobcat cub, approximately same size as Ember. No sign of the mother yet." They continued their surveillance for another 20 minutes, documenting the cub's movements and vocalizations while watching for any indication of an adult bobcat in the vicinity. The cub appeared periodically at the log's entrance, mewling with increasing distress before retreating into the shelter. Behavior consistent with a young animal seeking its mother, but receiving no response. "We need to make a decision," Meredith finally said, lowering the binoculars. "That cub is vocalizing continuously with no response from an adult. The pitch indicates hunger and distress, but not immediate medical crisis. However, dehydration and starvation become serious concerns if it's been separated for more than 24 hours. Marina checked her watch. "We've been observing for almost 30 minutes with no sign of the mother. If she were nearby, she'd likely have responded to those distress calls." The ethical complexity of wildlife intervention weighed heavily on both women. Removing a wild animal from its habitat was never a decision to be taken lightly, particularly when that animal was a member of a species already under pressure from habitat loss and human encroachment. Yet leaving a dependent cub to certain death when intervention was possible presented its own moral dilemma. "We'll try one more approach," Meredith decided. "I want to get close enough for a proper visual assessment of the cub's condition. If it shows signs of significant distress or injury, we'll intervene. If it appears healthy and well-nourished, we'll set up remote monitoring equipment and check back in a few hours." Marina nodded, packing away the microphone while Meredith signaled to Kyle, who had maintained his position at the agreed perimeter. He approached quietly, moving with the practiced stealth of an experienced woodsman. "Confirmed bobcat cub in the log," Meredith informed him in a low voice. "No sign of the mother despite continuous distress calls from the cub. I need to get closer for visual assessment before making an intervention decision." Kyle glanced at the fallen tree, calculating the approach options. "The creek's carved that new channel since the flood. You'll need to cross it to reach the log, and that bank looks unstable." "I see a crossing point about 15 yards downstream," Meredith replied, already gathering her field kit. "The water's shallow there, running over bedrock. Should be safe." "Enough." The concern in Kyle's expression was evident, but he nodded. "I'm coming with you." That soil around the root ball is completely undermined. If it shifts while you're examining the cub, Meredith wanted to argue but recognized the legitimacy of his caution. The landscape had been radically altered by the flooding, creating hazards that might not be immediately apparent to even experienced field personnel. All right, but we maintain absolute quiet during the approach. If the mother is nearby but hiding because of our presence, we want to give her every opportunity to reveal herself. Together, they made their way carefully downstream to the crossing point Meredith had identified, a natural rock shelf where the creek spread wide and shallow. The water barely reached their ankles as they crossed, though the smooth stones beneath required careful footing. On the far bank, they paused to listen, hearing the cub's plaintive calls still emanating from the log about 20 yards ahead. The approach required navigating a tangle of flood debris, branches, sediment, and, unfortunately, human trash that had been carried downstream from somewhere upriver. Meredith noted the plastic bottles and food wrappers with a grimace of disapproval, mentally adding another habitat cleanup project to the center's community engagement calendar. As they drew, within 10 yards of the log, the cub's vocalizations suddenly stopped. Meredith froze, signaling Kyle to do the same. Had the cubs sensed their presence? Or was there another factor at play? Perhaps the return of the mother? They waited, barely breathing, for nearly a minute before a small face appeared at the log's entrance, golden eyes blinking in the dappled sunlight. Meredith's breath caught in her throat. The resemblance to Ember was unmistakable. The same distinctive markings, the same proportions that suggested they were indeed from the same litter. But unlike Ember's battered condition, this cub appeared physically uninjured, its fur clean and full, its movements coordinated if somewhat weakened. Definitely a sibling, she whispered to Kyle, who nodded in agreement. Female, based on size and facial structure. She looks hungry and distressed, but not injured. The cub retreated slightly, at the sound of their whispers, but curiosity quickly overcame caution. A moment later, she emerged further from the log, revealing her full body. Thin, but not emaciated, her coat showing the healthy sheen of a cub that had, until recently, been properly cared for. The mother must have rescued her from the flood, but couldn't maintain the new den site, Meredith theorized quietly. Maybe injured herself, or driven off by other predators taking advantage of the ecosystem disruption. Kyle nodded grimly. Mountain lions have been pushing into this territory since the fire destroyed part of their range last summer. A female bobcat with cubs would avoid confrontation, even if it meant abandoning a temporary shelter. As they watched, the cub took a few tentative steps from the log, her movements betraying increasing weakness. Hunger and dehydration were taking their toll, despite her otherwise good condition. When she attempted to return to the shelter, she stumbled slightly, her coordination faltering, a warning sign that her condition was deteriorating rapidly. That decides it, Meredith said with quiet authority. She's weakening by the hour. If the mother were returning, she'd have done so by now. With a final glance at the surrounding forest to confirm no adult bobcat was approaching, Meredith reached into her field kit for capture equipment, a specialized transport container, lightweight gloves, and a small towel that would help minimize stress during handling. Every movement was measured and deliberate, designed to create as little disturbance as possible in case her assessment of the situation was incorrect. "Let's bring her home," she said to Kyle, her voice soft but determined. Her brother's waiting. The capture went more smoothly than either Meredith or Kyle had anticipated. The female cub, weakened by hunger and separation, offered only token resistance as Meredith gently secured her with the towel and transferred her to the transport container. Unlike her brother's near catatonic state during his rescue, this cub remained alert throughout the process, golden eyes tracking every movement with a mixture of fear and desperate hope that tugged at Meredith's professional detachment. "She's in much better condition than Ember was," Meredith noted as they carefully made their way back across the makeshift crossing. "Dehydrated and hungry, but no obvious injuries. If they are littermates, she must have been carried to safety by the mother before the flooding intensified. Kyle nodded, holding branches aside to create a clearer path for Meredith as she carried the precious cargo. The timing supports that theory. The first flash flood warning came around midnight, but the major surge didn't hit this area until nearly dawn. The mother would have had several hours to move her litter. But she couldn't reach Ember in time, Meredith concluded, the story assembling itself from the fragments of evidence. He was probably swept downstream during the mother's attempt to relocate the litter, ending up in that drainage culvert where the crows found him. The piercing calls of several crows echoed through the forest, as if summoned by the mention of their role in the drama, their dark forms visible through the canopy as they tracked the human's movement below. Meredith unconsciously held the transport container closer, the memory of those same birds attacking the defenseless Ember still vivid in her mind. Marina and the other rangers were waiting at the agreed rendezvous point, their expressions eager for news. "Success?" Marina asked, already preparing the medical field kit for preliminary assessment. "Female Bobcat Cub, approximately 3 weeks old, same as Ember," Meredith confirmed, carefully setting the transport container on a flat rock surface. "No obvious injuries, but moderate dehydration and hunger. Physically stronger than Ember was at intake, but showing increasing weakness." While Marina prepared rehydration fluids, Meredith conducted a more thorough field assessment, gently examining the cub through the opening in the transport container. The similarities to Ember were striking. The same distinctive facial markings, the same proportionate limb length, the same tawny fur with characteristic juvenile spotting. This cub was slightly smaller than her brother, typical of female bobcats, but otherwise appeared to be a perfect match for littermate status. "I'd estimate they're from the same birth cohort," Meredith told the assembled team as she administered subcutaneous fluids with practiced efficiency. "Based on developmental markers, both cubs are approximately 21-24 days old, just at the age when they would normally begin short explorations outside the den, but still be entirely dependent on the mother for nutrition and protection." Lau. "You reunite them at the center?" Theo asked, the student's academic interest clearly tempered with genuine concern for the cub's welfare. "Absolutely," Meredith replied, checking the cub's hydration response as the fluids began to take effect. "Sibling socialization is crucial for proper development in phalods. Having a littermate will significantly improve both cubs' rehabilitation prospects." The significance of this point wasn't lost on Marina, who had been helping prepare the cub for transport back to the center. "It changes everything for Ember. Solo rehabilitation of predator cubs is incredibly challenging. We can provide physical care and limited environmental enrichment, but we can't teach another bobcat's natural behaviors and social cues." "Exactly," Meredith agreed. "What we can't provide, they can learn from each other. The social grooming, play fighting, communication signals, all the subtle behaviors that would normally be reinforced by both mother and siblings." As the team prepared to depart, Meredith found herself alongside Kyle, both of them gazing back at the fallen log that had provided temporary shelter for the orphaned cub. The ranger's expression was contemplative, a mixture of satisfaction at the successful rescue and awareness of the complex intervention they had just performed in nature's processes. "Second thoughts?" Meredith asked quietly, recognizing the look. From her own moments of ethical reflection, Kyle shook his head slowly. "Not about the rescue, but I was just thinking about the mother. If she survived the flood, she's out there somewhere, perhaps still searching for her cubs." The image was a poignant one. The female bobcat moving silently through the disrupted forest, calling for young that would never answer. Meredith had considered this possibility since the moment she'd first spotted Ember in the drainage culvert. The weight of human intervention in natural processes never far from her consciousness as a wildlife professional. "We'll never know her fate," she acknowledged. "But we do know the cubs wouldn't have survived without intervention. Sometimes that has to be enough." "I suppose conservation is always about these impossible choices," Kyle said. The balance between individual welfare and natural processes, between intervention and restraint. Meredith nodded, surprised and impressed by his articulation of the dilemma that had shaped her entire career. That's exactly it. And there are no perfect answers, just the best decisions we can make with the information we have at each moment. Their philosophical exchange was interrupted by Marina calling from the trail ahead. Dr. Tanner, the cub's becoming more responsive. To the fluids. I think we should head back to the center while she's stabilized. The return journey passed quickly, the successful rescue creating an atmosphere of cautious optimism among the team. Meredith maintained regular checks on the female cub, who had been named Aspen by mutual agreement, keeping with the natural elements theme started with Ember, but also acknowledging the aspen grove near where the log had created her temporary shelter. By the time they reached the Wildlife Recovery Center, word of the second rescue had spread throughout the staff. Lisa was waiting at the entrance to the medical wing, her expression betraying both professional interest and personal investment in the outcome. "How does she look?" she asked, as Meredith carefully carried the transport container inside. "Better than I expected," Meredith replied, leading the way to the examination room. "No injuries, moderate dehydration responding well to treatment, hunger, but not starvation. If she passes the initial health screening, we can potentially introduce her to Ember as early as tomorrow." The examination confirmed Meredith's field assessment. Unlike her brother's traumatic injuries, Aspen's challenges were relatively straightforward, addressing the dehydration, beginning appropriate nutrition, and monitoring for any delayed symptoms of stress or illness that might not have been immediately apparent. Blood tests, fecal analysis, and a thorough physical examination revealed no underlying health concerns, leading Meredith to approve a specialized quarantine protocol that would allow for faster sibling reintroduction than was typically possible with wildlife patients. "We'll keep them in adjacent enclosures initially," she explained to the rehabilitation team as they prepared Aspen's temporary housing. "Visual and olfactory contact without physical interaction for the first 24 hours, then supervised introduction if both cubs continue stable trajectories." The adjacent enclosure setup was ready by late afternoon. Ember, who had been napping after his most recent feeding, woke as the team made final preparations in the connecting space. His recovery continued to impress everyone involved in his care. Though the damage to his eye remained evident, his overall strength, coordination, and engagement with his environment showed remarkable improvement from the half-drowned victim Meredith had pulled from the floodwaters. "He senses something's different," Marina observed, watching as Ember became increasingly alert, his nose working actively as he detected the new scents being introduced to the environment. "Look at that whisker action." The moment of truth came. As they carefully transferred Aspen to her side of the divided enclosure, removing her from the transport container with minimal handling to avoid creating negative associations with the new environment. As soon as she was released, she moved cautiously to the mesh divider separating her space from Ember's, her whiskers and ears forward in an expression of intense curiosity. On the other side, Ember had gone completely still, his golden eye fixed on the newcomer with an intensity that suggested recognition beyond simple interest in a novel stimulus. For several long moments, the two cubs observed each other across the divide, the room silent except for the soft sounds of their accelerated breathing. Then, simultaneously, both cubs emitted the distinctive churring vocalization unique to bobcat littermates, a sound rarely heard in rehabilitation settings, as it typically occurred only between siblings that had been together since birth. The soft, rhythmic sound continued for nearly a minute, the cubs moving closer to the mesh divider, until they were nearly touching through the barrier. "They recognize each other," Lisa whispered, her scientific objectivity momentarily overcome by the power of the moment. "Actual littermate recognition after separation." Meredith nodded, unable to speak past the unexpected tightness in her throat. In her 20 years of wildlife medicine, she had witnessed countless remarkable moments: critically injured animals taking their first steps toward recovery, orphaned youngsters developing survival skills against the odds, rehabilitated adults returning successfully to the wild. Yet something about this reunion struck a deeper chord: the primal connection between two tiny wildcats who had survived separate traumas and found each other again through human intervention. "We'll accelerate the introduction timeline," she finally said, her professional voice returning as she observed the cubs' continued positive interaction through the divider. "Supervised physical contact tomorrow morning, assuming no overnight complications for either cub." As the team completed their notes and prepared to leave the cubs to settle into their adjusted environment, Meredith found herself lingering, watching the siblings as they maintained their positions near the mesh divider, occasionally touching noses through the small openings. Neither showed any sign of the stress typically associated with captive wildlife in new environments. No pacing, no repetitive movements, no withdrawal behaviors. Instead, their body language reflected a remarkable calm, as if each cub's presence provided the other with a security that no human-designed enrichment could replicate. "This changes their whole rehabilitation trajectory, doesn't it?" Kyle asked, quietly, having remained after the others departed to observe this crucial phase of the process. "Completely," Meredith agreed, finally turning away from the enclosure to gather her notes. "Singleton predator cubs have significantly lower release success rates than those rehabilitated with conspecifics. Having a litter mate for social learning, comfort, and behavioral development addresses one of our biggest challenges in bobcat rehabilitation." Kyle smiled, the expression warming his usually reserved features. "So finding Aspen wasn't just good for her, it might have saved both their futures." "That's exactly right," Meredith replied, allowing herself to share his evident satisfaction in the outcome. Ember's physical injuries would have been manageable either way, but the developmental hurdles of solo rehabilitation might have been insurmountable. Now, they'll learn from each other in ways we simply can't replicate. As they walked together toward the exit, Meredith found herself reviewing the extraordinary chain of events that had brought the siblings to this point. The devastating flood, the cruel attack by opportunistic crows, the timely human interventions, and the remarkable resilience of two tiny wildcats, barely 3 weeks into their lives. So many points where the story could have ended differently, where nature's indifferent processes might have claimed these lives without notice or record. "I keep thinking about those crows," Kyle said suddenly, as if following a parallel track in his own thoughts. "If they hadn't attacked Ember, you might never have spotted him in that drainage culvert. Their cruelty inadvertently saved him." Meredith considered this perspective, the intricate connections between seeming misfortune and ultimate survival. "Nature doesn't operate on our moral frameworks," she said finally. The crows weren't being cruel, they were being crows, following the imperative to exploit available resources. But you're right that without their activity drawing my attention, Ember would almost certainly have drowned or died of exposure, and without Ember's rescue, we'd never have been alert to the possibility of a sibling, never investigated that hiker's report with the same urgency," Kyle continued, completing the thought. One intervention created the conditions for the second. They had reached the center's main entrance, the late afternoon sun casting long shadows across the parking area. In the distance, the mountains stood sentinel against the darkening sky, the wild landscape that had nearly claimed the bobcat cubs now peaceful in the fading light. "Will you come back tomorrow for the introduction?" Meredith asked, surprising herself with the invitation. "You've been part of their journey from the beginning. Seems fitting you should witness the next chapter." Kyle's expression brightened with genuine pleasure at the suggestion. "I'd like that. My patrol schedule has me in this sector again tomorrow. I could stop by in the afternoon if that works for your timeline." "Perfect," Meredith replied, feeling an unexpected warmth that she attributed to professional satisfaction in the day's successful outcomes. The cubs should be ready for supervised physical contact by then, assuming their first night in proximity goes well. As Kyle departed in his Forest Service vehicle, Meredith remained for a moment on the center's front steps, gazing back at the building where two orphaned wildcats now slept in neighboring enclosures, their futures intertwined in ways that defied the natural tragedy that had first separated them. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, the careful process of rebuilding what the flood had nearly destroyed, not just physical health, but the complex web of instinct, learning, and wildness that defined their species. One day at a time, she murmured to herself and turned to head back inside for one final check on her patients before the night shift took over. Tomorrow's challenges would come soon enough. For now, it was enough that both cubs were safe, healing, and most importantly, no longer alone. Dawn at the Wildlife Recovery Center always carried a particular quality, a liminal moment between the quiet vigilance of the night shift and the structured activity of daytime operations. Meredith had always appreciated these early hours, often arriving before her scheduled time to experience the peaceful transition and check on critical patients before the day's demands began in earnest. This morning, her anticipation lent an additional urgency to her pre-dawn routine. She arrived at the center just as the first hints of light touched the eastern horizon, the building still mostly dark except for the essential monitoring stations and security lighting. The night technician, Jasper, looked up from his documentation as she entered, his expression brightening with recognition. "Thought you might be in early," he said, reaching for the clipboard containing the overnight observations. Both cubs had an excellent night. Minimal stress behaviors, consistent vital signs, and, this is the interesting part, synchronized sleep cycles. They were active and resting at almost identical intervals despite the separation barrier. Meredith accepted the clipboard, scanning the detailed notes with professional thoroughness, while unable to entirely suppress her personal investment in these particular patients. "Any vocalizations overnight?" Periodic contact calls, especially during their active phases. The frequency increased whenever one cub moved away from the divider. Jasper's tone held the measured excitement of a scientist observing significant data. It's textbook sibling recognition behavior. "I've documented similar patterns in our orphaned otters last year, but it's rare to see in felids, especially after trauma and separation." "Excellent," Meredith murmured, moving toward the rehabilitation wing where the cubs were housed. "Any changes to Ember's eye condition overnight?" "None apparent. Discharge remains minimal, no increase in swelling or discomfort behaviors. He's adapting well to the visual impairment. His spatial mapping of the enclosure has improved significantly. Since yesterday, they reached the observation window that allowed monitoring of the cub's enclosure without direct visual contact that might create human associations. Through the one-way glass, Meredith could see both cubs awake and alert in their respective spaces, positioned close to the mesh divider that prevented physical contact while allowing scent and visual connection. Ember was engaged in methodical grooming, his movements showing the improved coordination that had developed during his recovery. Aspen was more active, exploring the perimeter of her enclosure with the characteristic bobcat mixture of caution and curiosity, though she returned frequently to the divider where her brother remained. Their behavior overnight suggests they're ready for supervised physical introduction, Meredith decided, making notes on the care plan attached to the clipboard. "We'll proceed this morning rather than waiting until afternoon as originally scheduled. The sooner they can engage in natural sibling behaviors, the better for their development." Jasper nodded, stifling a yawn as his 12-hour shift approached its conclusion. "Lisa's scheduled to arrive at 7. Should I ask her to delay the regular morning protocols until you've completed the introduction?" "Please, and have Marina join us when she arrives. I want experienced eyes on every aspect of this process." Meredith checked the time, 5:43 a.m. She had over an hour to prepare the environment and review the introduction protocols before the rest of the team arrived. After Jasper departed to complete his shift handover, Meredith used the time to make careful preparations for the cubs. First physical contact since their traumatic separation. In wildlife rehabilitation, such reintroductions required meticulous planning to minimize stress and prevent potential aggression, even between littermates. She adjusted the temperature and lighting in the enclosure to optimal comfort levels, positioned natural barriers that would provide security options if either cub became overwhelmed, and prepared emergency response equipment in the unlikely event of negative interaction. By the time Lisa and Marina arrived, everything was in place for the controlled introduction. The three women gathered at the observation window for a final assessment before proceeding. They continue to show positive recognition behaviors, Lisa noted, watching as the cubs mirrored each other's movements along the divider. Consistent. Eye contact, aligned body language, synchronized vocalizations. All indicators suggest they'll respond well to physical reintroduction. Marina nodded in agreement. Aspen has been initiating more contact attempts through the mesh. Notice how she keeps extending her paw toward Ember? That's a classic invitation to social grooming in juvenile felids. And Ember's response is appropriate, Meredith added, her experienced eye noting the subtle communication signals passing between the siblings. No defensive posturing, no territorial displays. He's maintaining equal interest in the interaction. The decision made, they moved to implement the introduction protocol. Marina would operate the specialized divider mechanism that would gradually create an opening between the two spaces, while Lisa prepared to document every aspect of the interaction for their research records. Meredith would oversee the process, ready to intervene if any concerning behaviors emerged. Initiating divider retraction, Marina announced quietly, activating the system that would slowly slide a section of the mesh barrier into a recessed wall pocket, creating a passage between the two enclosures. The mechanism moved almost silently, specifically designed to avoid startling wildlife patients with sudden noises. Both cubs became immediately alert to the changing environment, their attention fixed on the gradually widening opening. Ember, typically more cautious since his injuries, maintained his position, ears forward and whiskers twitching as he processed the development. Aspen approached the opening with typical female boldness, her steps deliberate but not aggressive as she tested the new access point. For a breathless moment, the three humans watched as the cubs assessed this change in their circumstances. Then, with the natural grace of her species, Aspen crossed the threshold into her brother's space. Her body language communicative and intentional. Head lowered slightly, tail held in the neutral position that signaled peaceful intent. Ember remained still as his sister approached, only his rapidly moving whiskers betraying his intense focus on her advance. When she reached him, Aspen initiated the greeting ritual universal to felids, a gentle head touch that communicated recognition and acceptance. After a moment's hesitation, Ember responded, leaning into the contact and producing the soft, churring vocalization they had heard the previous day. Perfect introduction behavior, Lisa whispered, documenting the interaction with quiet efficiency. No hesitation in recognition, appropriate greeting rituals, immediate vocal confirmation. What followed exceeded even Meredith's optimistic expectations. As if making up for lost time, the cubs engaged in a comprehensive sequence of natural, sibling behaviors, mutual grooming focused particularly on the face and ears, tentative play initiation, scent marking to create a shared olfactory profile. Most significant was Ember's willingness to allow Aspen to investigate his injured eye. Her gentle inspection followed by intensive grooming of the area in a behavior that mirrored what their mother would have provided had she remained with them. Remarkable, Marina murmured, watching as Aspen's ministrations elicited a response of complete relaxation from Ember. She's providing exactly the care he needs without any training or guidance from us. It's innate, Meredith explained, though the sight moved her despite her scientific understanding of the behavior. Mutual grooming serves multiple functions in felids: hygiene, parasite control, bond reinforcement, and wound care. She's recognizing his injury and responding with appropriate attention. For nearly 2 hours, The team observed the reunited siblings as they re-established their connection through increasingly complex interactions. Initial caution gave way to more energetic engagement, short bursts of play fighting that tested boundaries while strengthening muscles and reflexes, coordinated exploration of the enlarged environment, periods of synchronized rest during which they maintained physical contact despite the availability of separate sleeping areas. Most encouraging to Meredith was the way Aspen naturally accommodated her brother's visual impairment, adjusting her play approaches to enter from his sighted side and providing additional tactile cues during their interactions. These adaptations weren't taught. They emerged organically from the siblings' communication and Aspen's observation of her brother's capabilities. This is why conspecific rehabilitation is so critical, Meredith explained to her team as they made notes on the successful introduction. We can provide excellent medical care and environmental enrichment, but we can't replicate this level of species-appropriate interaction. They're teaching each other more in these hours than we could accomplish in weeks of human-structured rehabilitation. The morning's success created ripples of optimism throughout the center as staff arrived and learned of the Cubs' reunion. By mid-morning, the siblings had settled into a comfortable routine, alternating between play sessions and shared rest periods, their movements increasingly synchronized as they re-established the rhythms disrupted by their separation. Around 11, Lisa appeared at the office doorway where Meredith was completing her documentation of the introduction. "Your Forest Service Ranger is here," she announced with a barely suppressed smile. "He says he's on his lunch break and wanted to check on the Cubs' progress." Meredith felt a warmth rise to her cheeks that she attributed to the lingering effects of the morning's professional satisfaction. "He's not my ranger, Lisa, and technically, he's not due until this afternoon." "Tell that to the man who's been finding excuses to visit every day since the rescue," Lisa replied with a knowing look. "Should I tell him you're busy with important paperwork, or would you like to show him the successful reunion yourself?" Despite her colleagues' teasing, Meredith felt an undeniable pleasure at the opportunity to share the morning's success with someone who had been present from the beginning of this unexpected journey. "I'll meet him in the observation area," she decided, gathering her notes. "He should see the results of our combined efforts." Kyle was waiting by the observation window, his Forest Service uniform slightly damp around the shoulders, suggesting he'd been working in the misty mountain conditions before coming to the center. His expression brightened visibly when he saw Meredith approaching. "I know I'm early," he said by way of greeting, "but I was helping clear debris from the north trail and found myself nearby. Thought I'd check in before heading back out." "Perfect timing, actually," Meredith replied, gesturing toward the window where the Cubs could be seen curled together in a patch of artificial sunlight created by the environmental controls. "We completed the introduction this morning rather than waiting until afternoon. They've been together for about 5 hours now." Kyle moved closer to the window, his expression softening as he observed the peaceful scene. "They look like they were never separated," he said quietly. "Is that Ember?" With his head resting on Aspen's back, Meredith nodded, unable to suppress a smile at his accurate observation of the Cubs' bonding behavior. "That's one of the classic comfort positions for Bobcat siblings. We see it in camera trap footage of wild family groups. The littermates maintain physical contact during rest periods, often with overlapped positioning that maximizes warmth and security. And his eye? How's that progressing?" "Better than expected, actually. Dr. Patel's treatment protocol is showing positive results, and Aspen's natural grooming behavior is providing additional benefit. We're seeing reduced inflammation and some indication of improved tracking from the injured eye, though it's too soon to know if he'll regain functional vision." Kyle continued watching the Cubs, his expression thoughtful. Will the vision impairment prevent his eventual release? It was the fundamental question that shaped every wildlife rehabilitation effort, the difficult calculation of what constituted viable recovery for a wild animal. Meredith had been considering this question since the moment she'd pulled Ember from the floodwaters, weighing medical factors against ethical considerations. Individual welfare against species conservation needs? Not necessarily, she answered carefully. Bobcats with partial vision loss have been successfully released, particularly when the impairment is unilateral, as in Ember's case. The key factors will be his ability to develop compensatory skills during rehabilitation, strength in his other senses, and, most critically, his hunting proficiency when we begin live prey testing. And having his sister with him, does that improve his chances? Significantly. Solo predator cubs face enormous challenges in developing proper hunting skills without maternal teaching or sibling practice. With Aspen, Ember will have a natural training partner for developing the coordination, timing, and techniques essential for survival. They'll learn from each other's successes and failures in a way that human-structured rehabilitation simply can't replicate. As they spoke, the cubs began to stir from their rest period, Aspen initiating a new play sequence by gently batting at her brother's ear. Ember responded immediately, rolling into a defensive posture that protected his vulnerable abdomen while allowing him to engage with his sister's playful attack. The movement was fluid and natural, showing none of the hesitation that had characterized his earlier recovery period. They'll be starting their journey to release soon then? Kyle asked, watching the play fighting with evident appreciation for its purpose in developing survival skills. The journey's already begun, Meredith explained, her professional passion evident in her voice. Every interaction they have now is building toward eventual independence. We'll move them to progressively larger and more naturalistic enclosures over the next several months, introducing appropriate environmental challenges and gradually reducing human contact until they're essentially living as wild bobcats within the confines of our rehabilitation facility. Kyle nodded thoughtfully. And then we'll conduct a series of assessments: hunting proficiency with live prey, appropriate fear responses to potential predators, natural foraging behaviors, proper territorial marking. If they meet all our criteria, we'll identify an appropriate release site with adequate prey base, minimal human activity, and suitable denning opportunities, likely somewhere in the protected wilderness areas west of here. The cubs had escalated their play, now engaged in a vigorous chase around the perimeter of the enclosure, their movements showing the building strength and coordination that would eventually serve them in hunting and territorial defense. Watching them, it was difficult to reconcile these energetic, increasingly capable young predators with the helpless victims they had rescued just days before. It's remarkable, Kyle said, softly, echoing Meredith's unspoken thought. From the brink of death to this in less than a week. Wildlife has extraordinary resilience when given the right support, Meredith replied, feeling a rare moment of unguarded pride in her profession and the difference it made in individual lives like Ember and Aspen's. Our job is to provide that support without undermining the wildness that defines them. They continued watching the cubs in companionable silence, united by their shared investment in this unexpected journey that had brought two humans and two wildcats together through a series of chance events and deliberate choices. Outside, the spring rain had resumed, pattering gently against the observation window and reminding them of the storm that had initiated this entire story. I should get back to my patrol route, Kyle said eventually, though his reluctance was evident in his lingering gaze on the cubs. We're still assessing flood damage in the eastern sector, but I'm glad I stopped by to see this. I'm glad you did too, Meredith replied with unexpected sincerity. You've been part of their story from the beginning. It seems right that you should witness this chapter as well. As Kyle prepared to leave, he paused at the door, turning back with a hesitant expression. I know you'll be busy with their rehabilitation, but I'd like to keep following their progress, if that's all right. Maybe I could stop by occasionally, professionally speaking, of course, he added quickly. For my Forest Service reports on wildlife displacement after the flooding. Meredith felt that unexpected warmth return, and this time she didn't try to attribute it to professional satisfaction alone. I think that could be arranged, she replied with a small smile. for professional documentation purposes, naturally. After Kyle departed, Meredith remained at the observation window, watching as Ember and Aspen's play session gradually wound down into another period of mutual grooming and rest. Their synchronized movements and evident comfort with each other spoke to the profound resilience of life's connections. How quickly the bond between siblings had reasserted itself despite the trauma of separation. How naturally they had fallen back into the ancient patterns encoded in their species' DNA. "You two are going to be just fine," she murmured, making a final note in their care plan before turning to attend to her other responsibilities. Behind her, bathed in the artificial sunlight of their controlled environment, 2 bobcat cubs slept, peacefully together, their futures now intertwined in ways that neither flood nor human intervention could permanently sever. The weeks that followed transformed both Ember and Aspen in ways that continually impressed the rehabilitation team. Their physical development accelerated, baby fat giving way to lean muscle as their play sessions increased in complexity and duration. Ember's eye, while not fully recovered, had stabilized with remarkable improvement under Dr. Patel's treatment protocol. Though his vision remained compromised on that side, he had developed impressive compensatory behaviors, turning his head slightly when approaching obstacles to maximize input from his uninjured eye, and relying more heavily on his whiskers and hearing to navigate complex environments. Most encouraging was the siblings' synchronized development of natural behaviors critical for eventual release. Their play increasingly mimicked hunting sequences, stalking, pouncing, and killing enrichment toys designed to approximate the size and movement patterns of their natural prey. Aspen, slightly more advanced in her motor skills, often initiated these sequences, with Ember learning through observation and participation. The rehabilitation team documented every aspect of this progress, creating a comprehensive record that would ultimately determine the cubs' release eligibility. 6 weeks after the rescue, Meredith stood before the center's board of directors, presenting the quarterly rehabilitation report, with particular emphasis on the Bobcat siblings who had become something of a sensation among wildlife professionals throughout the region. Cubs 23-47 and 23-48, known as Ember and Aspen respectively, continue to exceed developmental benchmarks for captive rehabilitation, she explained, advancing through slides that showcased the cubs' progress. At approximately 9 weeks of age, they are displaying all age-appropriate behaviors for wild bobcats, with minimal evidence of negative impacts from their early trauma and temporary separation. The board members, a mixture of wildlife biologists, veterinarians, conservation experts, and major donors, reviewed the comprehensive data with expressions of approval. Dr. Eleanor Woodson, the board chair and founding director of the center, leaned forward with particular interest. "The ophthalmological progress in the male cub is especially noteworthy," she observed, studying the detailed medical charts. "Dr. Patel's treatment approach may have implications for other wildlife vision injuries. Has she indicated interest in publishing this case study?" "She has," Meredith confirmed. "We're collecting final data points for submission to the Journal of Wildlife Ophthalmology next quarter. The combination of conventional treatment and natural sibling grooming behavior presents a unique rehabilitation model that could inform protocols for other predator species." Another board member, Richard Gaines, representing the state's Conservation Commission, raised a different question. "Your report indicates plans for transitioning the cubs to the naturalistic enclosure next month. Given the male's visual impairment, do you have concerns about his readiness for that environment?" It was a valid question that reflected the fundamental tension in wildlife rehabilitation, balancing medical caution against the need for authentic environmental challenges that prepared animals for release. Meredith had been considering this issue extensively, consulting with Lisa and Marina to develop a transition plan that addressed Ember's specific needs without compromising the integrity of the rehabilitation process. "We've modified the standard protocol to incorporate a graduated transition," she explained, displaying the detailed plan on the presentation screen. The naturalistic enclosure has been sectioned into 3 progressive zones of increasing complexity and challenge. The cubs will master each zone before barriers are removed to grant access to the next level. This approach allows Ember to develop familiarity with features through systematic exploration while still experiencing authentic environmental challenges. Dr. Woodson nodded with approval. An excellent adaptation that maintains rehabilitation, integrity while acknowledging individual needs, and the timeline for potential release? Current projections suggest eligibility assessment at approximately 10 months, assuming continued development along expected trajectories. This would position a potential release for early spring next year, optimal timing for prey abundance and territorial establishment. The presentation continued with discussions of other rehabilitation cases, center operations, and upcoming research initiatives. But the Bobcat Cubs remained a focal point of interest throughout the meeting. When the formal agenda concluded, several board members lingered to ask additional questions about the siblings' progress and the innovative approaches being implemented in their rehabilitation. As the boardroom finally emptied, Dr. Woodson remained behind, approaching Meredith with the measured step that had become more pronounced in recent years as arthritis took its toll on the 72-year-old biologist's once tireless frame. "Walk with me to see them?" she suggested, her formal demeanor softening into the mentor role she had long held in Meredith's career. "It's been several weeks since my last direct observation." Together they made their way through the center's main building toward the rehabilitation wing, Dr. Woodson using the time to inquire about Meredith's other projects and recent research publications. Their professional relationship spanned nearly Meredith's entire career, from her first internship at the center 20 years ago through her eventual appointment as head wildlife veterinarian. Though their interactions now carried the weight of mutual professional respect, Meredith still felt occasional flashes of the eager student seeking approval from the pioneering woman who had established one of the country's premier wildlife rehabilitation facilities. "I've been following your documentation closely," Dr. Woodson commented as they approached the observation area for the cubs' current enclosure. "Your notes on their social learning patterns are particularly insightful. There's potential for a broader study there. Comparative analysis of rehabilitation outcomes in singleton versus sibling groups across predator species." "I've been thinking along similar lines," Meredith admitted, pleased by the validation of her research instincts. Ember's case in particular highlights the limitations of our traditional approaches to solo predator rehabilitation. Without Aspen, his developmental trajectory would be significantly different, regardless of our intervention efforts. They reached the observation window in time to witness an impressive display of the siblings' developing hunting skills. The rehabilitation team had implemented a complex enrichment setup that morning, a system of pulleys and counterweights that moved target objects through the enclosure in patterns designed to mimic prey movement. Aspen was currently stalking one such target, her body low to the ground, every muscle tensed in perfect predatory focus. Ember had positioned himself on the opposite side of the enclosure, effectively creating a pincer approach that would maximize their hunting efficiency. "Coordinated hunting behavior," Dr. Woodson noted with evident satisfaction. "Rare to see in captive rehabilitation at this age without maternal teaching." "They've been developing this approach over the past week," Meredith explained, watching as the siblings executed their strategy with remarkable precision for their age. Ember typically takes the secondary position, compensating for his visual limitation by relying on Aspen's initial targeting, then cutting off the escape route. As if illustrating her point, Ember launched his attack just as the target changed direction in response to Aspen's approach, effectively intercepting it mid-flight. The capture triggered the release mechanism designed to provide appropriate reward for successful hunting behavior, dispensing a small amount of species-appropriate protein into a specialized feeding device. "Magnificent," Dr. Woodson murmured, watching as the siblings shared the reward according to natural bobcat social protocols, the successful hunter consuming the first portion before allowing the other access. They're developing exactly as they would in the wild, despite everything. They continued their observation in companionable silence, two scientists appreciating the perfect fusion of instinct, adaptation, and rehabilitation support playing out before them. After several minutes, Dr. Woodson turned to Meredith with an expression that held both professional assessment and personal affection. "You've done exceptional work with these cubs, Meredith, not just medically, but in maintaining the delicate balance between intervention and natural development that defines true wildlife rehabilitation." The praise from her longtime mentor carried particular weight, warming Meredith unexpectedly. "Thank you, Eleanor. But it's been a team effort throughout. Lisa's rehabilitation protocols, Marina's enrichment innovations, Dr. Patel's specialized treatment plan." "True enough," Dr. Woodson acknowledged with a knowing smile, "though I note you've omitted mention of your Forest Service Ranger's contributions. Lisa tells me he's become quite invested in the cub's progress." Meredith felt a flush rising to her cheeks, annoyed at her body's betrayal of her carefully maintained professional demeanor. Ranger Blackwood has provided valuable ecological context related to the flooding event and habitat disruption. His input has been helpful in developing appropriate environmental enrichment. "Of course," Dr. Woodson replied, her tone suggesting she recognized the deliberate formality in Meredith's response. "And his regular visits are purely for professional documentation purposes, I'm sure." Before Meredith could formulate an appropriately deflective response, her attention was drawn to movement at the entrance to the rehabilitation wing. Kyle had appeared in the doorway, dressed in civilian clothes rather than his Forest Service uniform, a clear indication that he was visiting. Outside his official capacity, he hesitated upon seeing Meredith engaged in conversation, clearly debating whether to interrupt. Dr. Woodson followed her gaze, her expression warming with immediate understanding. "Ah, speaking of Ranger Blackwood, perfect timing. I've been hoping to discuss the habitat assessment for potential release sites with him." She moved toward the doorway with surprising energy, extending her hand in greeting. "Ranger Blackwood, I'm Eleanor Woodson. I don't believe we've formally met, though I've read your excellent habitat reports in Meredith's documentation." Kyle accepted the handshake with a respectful nod. "Dr. Woodson, it's an honor. Your work in wildlife rehabilitation has been tremendously influential in our Forest Service protocols for displaced predator species. How gratifying to hear. Perhaps you'd be willing to share your thoughts on the northwestern watershed area as a potential release site for our bobcat siblings. I understand you've been conducting post-flood ecological assessments in that region." The deft social maneuvering was so transparent that Meredith might have been annoyed if she weren't so impressed by her mentor's casual orchestration. Within moments, Dr. Woodson had drawn Kyle into a detailed conversation about habitat characteristics, while simultaneously creating a natural context for the three of them to continue observing the cubs together. The invitation hovered between them, professionally relevant yet carrying undertones that neither was quite ready to acknowledge directly. Meredith considered briefly, weighing the practical value of first-hand habitat assessment against her usual caution about maintaining clear boundaries between her professional and personal spheres. That would be valuable, she decided, choosing to focus on the legitimate professional benefit while allowing herself to acknowledge the simple truth that she enjoyed Kyle's company. "What time were you planning to start?" "I was thinking early morning, around sunrise. The wildlife activity is highest then, so you'd get the best sense of the ecosystem dynamics." He hesitated, then added with a hint of self-deprecating humor, "I can promise decent coffee from my thermos, but nothing approaching proper breakfast." Meredith found herself smiling, the expression feeling surprisingly natural despite her customary professional reserve. "I can contribute breakfast if you're handling the coffee. Fair division of resources." "A balanced ecosystem," Kyle agreed, his own smile warming his typically serious features. "I'll pick you up at 5:30. The center's address is in my files, but—" "I'll text you my home address," Meredith interrupted, making the decision before she could overthink it. It's on the way to the trailhead, more efficient. As they finalized the details of their jointly maintained fiction of purely professional interest, Ember and Aspen settled into one of their synchronized rest periods, curled together in the artificial sunlight that streamed through the specially designed skylight in their enclosure. Their physical connection, heads touching, bodies aligned in perfect trust, spoke to the profound resilience of bonds that could withstand separation, trauma, and the harsh indifference of natural forces. Watching them, Meredith felt an unexpected parallel to her own experience, how this unexpected rescue had created connections that extended beyond professional cooperation, drawing together lives that might otherwise never have intersected. From the terrible moment when crows had surrounded a defenseless bobcat cub, a sequence of choices and chances had unfolded that now encompassed not just the rehabilitation of two wild creatures, but the subtle reshaping of human lives as well. Tomorrow, then, she said softly, her gaze still on the peaceful cubs while acutely aware of Kyle's presence beside her. I'll look forward to seeing the watershed. So will I, he replied, the simple words carrying meaning beyond their surface value. It's a special place, worth knowing well. As Kyle departed, Meredith remained at the observation window, watching the sleeping cubs and reflecting on the unpredictable paths that life could take when nature's drama intersected with human compassion. The Bobcat siblings would continue their journey toward eventual freedom, growing stronger together until they were ready to return to the wild world that had nearly claimed them. And perhaps, Meredith acknowledged to herself with quiet honesty, her own journey had been similarly altered by that rainy morning when crows had led her to a tiny, desperate life, fighting for survival against overwhelming odds. Some interventions, it seemed, changed more than just the lives they were intended to save. Spring returned to the Cascade foothills, painting the landscape in vibrant greens and wildflower blooms that erased the last visible scars of the previous year's devastating floods. In the pre-dawn light, a small group gathered at the edge of the Northwestern Watershed Preserve, a protected wilderness area spanning thousands of acres of pristine bobcat habitat. Meredith checked the tracking collars one final time, adjusting the lightweight devices designed to dissolve after 18 months of monitoring. Beside her, Kyle held the specialized transport crates containing Ember and Aspen, now nearly full-grown at 11 months old. Their rehabilitation had been an unqualified success by every measure. Both cubs had mastered all necessary survival skills, demonstrated appropriate fear responses to potential threats, and maintained their essential wildness despite the human intervention that had saved their lives. Telemetry is active on both collars, Lisa confirmed, monitoring the signals on specialized equipment. We'll have data transmission for approximately 36 hours before they switch to the intermittent recording mode. Marina, who had been instrumental in the cubs' final preparation for release, stood with Dr. Woodson and several other staff members at a respectful distance. This moment represented the culmination of nearly a year's dedicated work. Not just the medical intervention that had saved two young lives, but the complex rehabilitation process that had prepared those lives for successful return to the wild. It's time, Meredith said softly, nodding to Kyle to position the crates at the release point they had carefully selected months before. A natural clearing with excellent sightlines, proximity to water, and abundant prey sign. Together, they opened the crate doors and stepped back, maintaining the deliberate silence that had characterized all human interactions with the cubs during their final rehabilitation phase. For several long moments, nothing happened. Then Aspen appeared at her crate opening, her golden eyes scanning the new environment with the intense focus of her species. She emerged cautiously but without fear, her powerful body moving with fluid grace as she took her first steps into true freedom. Ember followed seconds later, his movements equally confident despite the permanent visual limitation in his right eye. The siblings paused briefly, whiskers and ears working to process the rich sensory information of the wild forest around them. Then, with a synchronicity that had defined their recovery from the beginning, they moved forward into the underbrush, their tawny coats blending perfectly with the dappled morning light until they seemed to dissolve into the wilderness that was their birthright. No one spoke as the bobcats disappeared from view. The humans remained motionless, listening as the forest resumed its rhythm around them. Birdsong, rustling leaves, the distant murmur of the creek that had once nearly claimed Ember's life. The circle had completed itself, nature's harsh indifference balanced by its infinite capacity for renewal. Later, reviewing the first telemetry data from the Cubs' collars, Meredith and Kyle stood shoulder to shoulder at the center's monitoring station. The electronic dots on the screen showed the siblings moving confidently through their new territory, already beginning to establish the patterns that would define their wild lives. "They're going to be fine," Kyle said, his hand finding Meredith's with the easy familiarity that had developed between them over the months of shared purpose. "Yes," she agreed simply, watching the evidence of two wild lives continuing beyond the terrible moment that had brought them into her care. They always were. High above the wilderness preserve, a crow called to its companions, the harsh sound carrying across the valley, not a harbinger of tragedy this time, but simply one voice in the complex symphony of a world where cruelty and compassion, loss and recovery existed in perfect necessary balance.